18th-Century France, a time of powdered wigs, elaborate gowns, and complicated dating. It might seem worlds away from swiping right, but trust me, the quest for love and companionship was just as intricate, if not more so. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So imagine stepping into this world. The air is thick with perfume, social hierarchies are as rigid as a corset, and reputation is everything. Forget casual encounters, every interaction is a potential chess move in the game of love, or at least in the game of marriage. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of courtship rituals and romantic escapades, we need to understand the lay of the land. Think of it as navigating a minefield of social expectations, family pressures, and let's be honest, financial considerations. First things first, class. In 18th-century France, your social standing dictated almost every aspect of your life, and dating was no exception. We're talking about a society rigidly divided into estates. The aristocracy, with their inherited titles and vast estates, were at the top of the pyramid. Then came the clergy, wielding significant influence over moral and spiritual matters. And finally the third estate, everyone else, from wealthy merchants and lawyers to peasants and laborers. Now for the aristocracy, marriage was often less about love, and more about maintaining social status and securing the family's future. Think strategic alliances, mergers of wealthy families, and ensuring the continuation of noble bloodlines. Love? Well, that was often a bonus, not a necessity. For the rising merchant class, things were a little different. While lineage wasn't as crucial, wealth certainly was. Marriage could be a way to climb the social ladder, solidify business partnerships, or simply provide financial security. But even here, personal feelings weren't always the top priority. And then there were the commoners, the peasants and laborers who made up the vast majority of the population. For them, dating and marriage were often more practical matters. Finding a partner who could contribute to the household, share the workload, and raise a family was paramount. Romance might blossom, but survival was the primary concern. But social class was only one piece of the puzzle. Within each class, there were further distinctions and expectations that influenced the dating game. For example, unmarried women were expected to adhere to strict codes of conduct. Their reputations were carefully guarded, and any hint of scandal could ruin their chances of finding a suitable husband. Chaperones were essential. These older, often married, women acted as guardians of virtue, accompanying young ladies on social outings, ensuring that conversations remained appropriate, and preventing any, inappropriate behavior. Think of them as the ultimate wing women, but with a very strict agenda. Young men, on the other hand, had a bit more leeway. While they were still expected to behave respectfully towards women, they enjoyed greater freedom and social mobility. They could frequent coffee houses, attend the theater, and engage in intellectual discussions, all opportunities for meeting potential partners. Family approval was absolutely paramount. Parents held immense power over their children's marriage prospects, especially within the aristocracy. They often had the final say, and defying their wishes could have serious consequences, from disinheritance to social ostracism. And let's not forget the importance of dowries and marriage contracts. These legal agreements outlined the financial terms of the marriage, including the bride's dowry, the money and property she brought to the marriage, and the groom's obligations to provide for her. These contracts were often meticulously negotiated, ensuring the financial security of both families. So as you can see, the social landscape of 18th-century France was a complex web of rules, expectations, and power dynamics. Navigating this world required a delicate balance of charm, wit, and social savvy. It was a game with high stakes, where reputation, family honor, and financial security were all on the line. Now before we get lost in the dramas of the French court, let's pause and really appreciate the importance of places, how social interactions were physically formed and structured. Public spaces, think coffee houses, theaters, the rise of salons, even parks, became crucial social stages. Coffee houses were hubs for discussing politics, literature, and of course romance. Theatres and operas offered a spectacle, but also a chance to see and be seen, turning into vital social amphitheatres. And then there are the salons. These weren't hair salons, by the way. These were private gatherings, hosted by wealthy and influential women, providing a platform for intellectual discourse, artistic expression, and social networking. Salons were often the epicenter of progressive thought, where Enlightenment ideals were debated and disseminated. They also offered a more relaxed and intimate setting for romantic encounters, and in a time when the eyes held so much more importance and meaning, dress and appearance played a critical role in signaling availability and aspirations. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about conveying status, personality, and even intentions. Think of fashion as a language, with every detail, from the fabric of a gown to the placement of a beauty mark, carrying a specific message. So grab a cup of chamomile tea, settle in, and let's step together into the world of romance, intrigue, and high society dating in 18th century France. It's going to be a delightfully dramatic ride. Good evening, friends. Tonight, as we settle into our historical exploration, let's dim the mental lights and snuggle into the plush armchair of 18th century France. We're venturing into a world where romance was less about heart-fluttering encounters and more about strategic alliances, a world where marriage was less a love story and more a business deal. We'll learn tonight about the aristocratic marriage market, power, property, and lineage. Find your comfiest listening position and breathe easily as we begin. For the French aristocracy of the 18th century, finding a partner wasn't a matter of swiping right or catching eyes across a crowded room. It was a complex game, governed by power, property, and lineage. Marriage was, first and foremost, a means of securing and enhancing family fortunes and social standing. Love, well, that was often a happy accident, a pleasant bonus in a world where practicality reigned supreme. Imagine a grand chessboard, my friends, with families carefully positioning their sons and daughters to maximize their advantages. These advantages were simple: land, titles, and influence. A good marriage could bring a family out of debt, elevate their social rank, or consolidate their power in the royal court. A bad marriage, catastrophic. It could bankrupt a family, ruin their reputation, and diminish their standing for generations. Lineage, of course, was paramount. Blue blood needed to marry blue blood. While some families might be tempted by the allure of a wealthy commoner, a nouveau riche, such matches were generally frowned upon. The aristocracy prided itself on its ancient lineage, its noble heritage stretching back centuries. Marrying outside this circle risked diluting the bloodline, contaminating the purity of their noble stock. It was a bit dramatic, wasn't it? But that was the mindset of the time. Property, as you might imagine, was equally important. Land was the primary source of wealth and power in 18th century France. A family's holdings determined their income, their influence in their region, and their ability to support a lavish lifestyle. Marrying into a family with extensive estates was a surefire way to bolster one's own financial security. But it wasn't just about quantity, you see, it was also about location. Marrying into a family with land strategically located near one's own could consolidate control over a region, making it easier to administer and defend. And of course, proximity to the royal court at Versailles was highly desirable. Families with influence at court could secure lucrative positions for their sons and advantageous alliances for their daughters. Now let's talk about power. In the 18th century, power came in many forms: political influence, military command, and ecclesiastical authority. Marrying into a family with connections to powerful figures could open doors to opportunities that would otherwise be inaccessible. A well-placed marriage could secure a coveted position in the royal administration, a prestigious military appointment, or a high-ranking office in the church, all beneficial to the family name. Consider, for example, a young nobleman from a family with limited political clout. By marrying the daughter of a powerful minister, he could gain access to the corridors of power, learning the ins and outs of courtly intrigue and building relationships with influential figures. This in turn could lead to promotions, appointments, and ultimately, greater power for his own family. Or imagine a young noblewoman from a family with a distinguished military tradition. By marrying a celebrated general, she could elevate her family's prestige and secure a promising future for her brothers and sons in the armed forces. These alliances divorces were critical for families seeking to maintain their status and influence in a highly competitive social landscape. So how did this aristocratic marriage market actually function? Well, it was a carefully orchestrated process involving parents, relatives, friends, and professional matchmakers. The process often began years before a young person was even of marriageable age. Families would assess their options, weighing the pros and cons of various potential matches. They would consider not only the wealth, lineage, and power of the other family, but also the personality and character of the prospective spouse. After all, while marriage was primarily a business deal, it was also a lifelong commitment. A compatible match could make for a more harmonious household, even if love wasn't the primary consideration. Negotiations could be lengthy and complex, involving intricate discussions about dowries, marriage contracts, and future inheritances. Lawyers were often involved, ensuring that all parties were protected and that the terms of the agreement were legally binding. These contracts were meticulously drafted, specifying every detail of the financial arrangement. Dowries, of course, were a crucial component of the marriage market. A dowry was the property or money that a bride brought to her marriage, intended to support her during the marriage and in widowhood. The size of the dowry reflected the bride's social standing and the wealth of her family. A large dowry could make a bride more attractive to prospective grooms, while a small dowry could limit her options considerably. We'll dive deep into dowries in another section to come. Marriage contracts also addressed issues such as the wife's property rights, the inheritance of children, and the division of assets in the event of death or divorce. While divorce was rare in 18th century France, it was not unheard of, particularly among the aristocracy. A well-crafted marriage contract could protect a woman's financial interests and ensure that her children were provided for. And what about the individuals at the center of these negotiations, the young men and women whose futures were being decided? Well, their voices were often secondary to the interests of their families. Parental approval was essential, and children who defied their parents' wishes risked disinheritance and social ostracism. However, that is not to say that they had no agency whatsoever. Some young people were able to exert influence over the choice of their spouse, particularly if they possessed strong personalities or significant wealth of their own. And of course, love matches did occur, even within the confines of the aristocratic marriage market. Sometimes a young man and woman would genuinely fall in love, despite the practical considerations that governed their family's decisions. In these cases, parents might be willing to bend the rules, particularly if the match was otherwise advantageous. After all, a happy marriage was often seen as a more stable and productive one. But more often than not, love was a luxury that the aristocracy could not afford. Marriage was simply too important to be left to chance or emotion. It was a strategic alliance, a business deal, a means of securing and enhancing family fortunes and social standing. And in the world of 18th century France, that was often enough. So as you drift off tonight, remember the complexities of the aristocratic marriage market. Think about the power, the property, the lineage, and the delicate dance of negotiation and compromise. It was a world far removed from our own, yet it offers a fascinating glimpse into the social and economic realities of 18th century France. Sleep well, friends, and dream of gilded cages and calculated romances. Until next time. Alright friends, let's dim the lights a bit more, and settle in. Because now we're diving into the heart of 18th century French courtship, letters, visits, and the lost art of conversation. Imagine a world without instant messaging, without dating apps, without even the telegraph. In 18th century France, finding love, or at least a suitable marriage partner, was a slow, deliberate dance, choreographed by strict social rules. It all began with the written word. Letters were the lifeblood of courtship. More than just a quick thinking of you text, these were carefully crafted works of art, designed to impress, to charm, and to subtly signal interest. Handwriting mattered, paper quality mattered, the scent of the ink mattered. Imagine spending hours perfecting a single letter, knowing it could make or break your chances. The content itself was a delicate balancing act. Too forward, and you risked being seen as vulgar or desperate. Too reserved, and your affections might be misinterpreted. Wit, poetry, and philosophical musings were all fair game, offering glimpses into your character and intellect. Think of it as a highly sophisticated game of show, don't tell. You weren't just saying I like you, you were demonstrating why you were worthy of admiration. And of course, intermediaries played a vital role. A trusted friend or family member might act as a go-between, discreetly carrying letters and gauging the other person's interest. This wasn't just about delivering messages, it was about providing social cover. If the initial approach was rejected, the suitor could save face, claiming it was merely a friendly overture. Oh, the drama. If the letters went well, the next step was the carefully orchestrated visit. These weren't casual drop-ins, they were formal affairs, announced in advance and governed by strict rules of etiquette. The setting mattered immensely. A visit to a family's salon, a gathering of intellectuals and socialites, offered a chance to shine in a public setting, showcasing wit and charm before a wider audience. But perhaps even more important was the visit to ceremony. These were formal calls made to the woman's home, usually in the afternoon. The suitor would be received in the salon or drawing room, often in the presence of her mother or a chaperone. Think of it like meeting the parents, but on steroids, with societal judgment weighing heavily on every word. The duration of the visit was also strictly regulated. Too short, and you risked appearing uninterested. Too long, and you might overstay your welcome. The proper length signaled respect and sincere intentions. It was all about finding that Goldilocks zone. And what about the conversation? Well, this was where the true art of courtship came into play. Forget awkward silences or small talk about the weather. In 18th-century France, conversation was an art form, a display of wit, intellect and social grace. Topics ranged from literature and philosophy to politics, and the latest court gossip. But remember, this wasn't a debate club. The goal wasn't to win an argument, but to engage, to entertain, and to demonstrate your intellectual prowess. The esprit, or wit, was highly prized. The ability to deliver a clever quip, a subtle barb, or a perfectly timed pun could win you admiration and affection. But be careful. Wit could easily turn into sarcasm or mockery, which was a major turn-off. The line between charming and offensive was razor thin. And what about compliments? Ah yes, compliments were essential, but they had to be delivered with sincerity and discretion. Overly effusive praise risked sounding insincere or even vulgar. Focus on her intelligence, her artistic talents, her charitable works, anything but her physical beauty. At least, not at first. Those compliments were better served later in the courtship. Body language played a crucial role too. A slight bow, a lingering glance, a subtle touch of the hand. These small gestures could convey volumes. But again, discretion was key. Any hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation and jeopardize the entire courtship. Music also played a significant role in these courting rituals. A skilled musician could impress with their talent, serenading their beloved with a romantic ballad, or playing a lively sonata at a social gathering. Dancing was another opportunity for subtle flirtation. A carefully chosen dance partner, a graceful twirl, a fleeting touch. These moments could spark a connection that words couldn't express. And let's not forget the importance of gift giving. But these weren't lavish displays of wealth. Small thoughtful gifts were far more valued. A hand-picked flower, a beautifully bound book of poetry, a piece of needlework made with your own hands. These gestures showed sincerity and attention to detail. The gift itself was less important than the sentiment behind it. Throughout all of these rituals, the ever-present chaperone played a crucial role. Usually an older female relative or a trusted friend, the chaperone was there to ensure that proper etiquette was followed, and that no impropriety occurred. Imagine trying to flirt with someone while being constantly watched. It added a whole new layer of complexity to the game. These courting rituals weren't just about finding a spouse, they were about maintaining social order and reinforcing class distinctions. The aristocracy had its own set of rules, more formal and elaborate than those of the bourgeoisie. Commoners, of course, had their own customs, often simpler and more informal. Knowing and adhering to the appropriate rules was essential for navigating the complex social landscape of 18th-century France. As the courtship progressed, the visits would become more frequent, the letters more intimate, and the chaperone might become slightly less vigilant. Eventually, if all went well, the suitor would formally ask the woman's father for her hand in marriage. This was a solemn occasion, involving negotiations about dowries, marriage contracts, and the future of the two families. Love might be a factor, but practical considerations were often paramount. So the next time you swipe right on a dating app, take a moment to appreciate the slow, deliberate beauty of 18th-century French courtship. It may seem archaic and restrictive to us, but it was a world of carefully crafted words, meaningful gestures, and the lost art of conversation. And who knows, maybe we could learn a thing or two from these bygone rituals. I think it all sounds so elegant, don't you?
Now, let's talk about something that really grabbed attention back then: appearances. In 18th century France, how you looked wasn't just about personal style, it was a loud declaration of who you were, your status, your wealth, even your romantic availability. So let's dive into the world of powdered wigs, extravagant gowns, and beauty marks, and see how these things played a role in the game of love. For the aristocracy, dress and appearance were practically a religion. It was all about signifying status. Think of Versailles as a stage, and everyone was an actor in a meticulously costumed play. The clothes, the hairstyles, the makeup, everything was designed to project an image of power, wealth, and impeccable taste. Let's start with the gentleman. Now, forget everything you know about modern menswear. We're talking elaborate suits, often made of silk or velvet, embroidered with gold or silver thread. These weren't your comfy casual outfits. Colors were vibrant. Think deep blues, rich reds, and opulent golds. And of course, no aristocratic gentleman would be caught dead without a wig. Wigs were a huge deal. They were meticulously styled, often powdered with white or grey powder made from starch, and they came in all shapes and sizes. A large elaborate wig was a sign of status and wealth, showing you could afford the upkeep. And upkeep was no joke. These things needed regular cleaning, styling, and repowdering. Moving down the body, breeches were the standard legwear, tight-fitting and ending just below the knee. Stockings, usually silk, were a must, and shoes were often adorned with buckles made of precious metals. Swords were also a common accessory, not always for fighting, but as a symbol of nobility and honor. But it wasn't just about the clothes themselves, it was about the way you wore them. Posture was key. A gentleman had to stand tall, with his chest out and his shoulders back. This conveyed confidence and authority. And of course, good grooming was essential. A clean shave, a well-maintained wig, and attention to detail were all signs of a refined and cultured man. Now, let's turn our attention to the ladies, because oh boy, did they have a lot going on. Women's fashion in the 18th century was all about extravagance and artifice. The goal was to create an image of delicate beauty and refined elegance. The silhouette was everything. Think of the iconic wide panniered skirts. These were basically giant baskets worn under the dress to create an exaggerated hourglass shape. The wider the skirt, the higher the status. These skirts could be so wide that navigating doorways became a real challenge. On top, bodices were tightly fitted, often with a low neckline that emphasized the décolletage. Corsets were essential for achieving the desired shape. And these weren't the comfy corsets you might find today. They were stiff, boned contraptions that could restrict breathing and movement. But hey, beauty knows no pain, right? Dresses were made of luxurious fabrics like silk, satin, and brocade, adorned with lace, ribbons, and embroidery. Colors were often pastel, think pale pinks, blues, and yellows, but bolder colors were also popular, especially for evening wear. Just like the men, the details were important. Think tiny, delicate stitches, perfect seams, and embellishments that showed off the skill of the dressmaker. Hairstyles were another form of art. Women's hair was styled into elaborate towers, often incorporating wigs, extensions, and all sorts of decorations. Think feathers, flowers, jewels, and even miniature ships. These hairstyles could take hours to create and required the help of a skilled hairdresser. And just like the men's wigs, they were heavily powdered. Makeup was also essential. The ideal look was pale skin, rosy cheeks, and bright red lips. White face powder was used to create a flawless complexion, and rouge was applied to the cheeks for a healthy glow. Beauty marks, or mouches, were also popular. These were small patches of silk or velvet, often black, that were applied to the face to accentuate certain features, or to hide blemishes. They were strategically placed to draw attention to the eyes, lips, or cleavage. But just like with the men, it wasn't just about the clothes and makeup, it was about the way you carried yourself. Grace and poise were essential. A lady had to move with elegance and refinement, her head held high, and her gaze demure. The way you walked, the way you sat, the way you spoke, everything was carefully cultivated, to project an image of sophistication and allure. So, how did all of this play into dating? Well, appearance was the first impression. It was how you signaled your availability and your desirability. A well-dressed, well-groomed man or woman was seen as a good catch, someone who was worthy of attention and courtship. For women, fashion could also be used to send subtle messages. The color of your dress, the placement of your beauty marks, even the way you held your fan could all convey differently. A fan in particular was a powerful tool for flirting. There was a whole language of the fan, with different movements and positions conveying different messages. Of course, all of this came with a hefty price tag. Maintaining this level of appearance required a significant investment of time and money. Clothes, wigs, makeup, hairdressers, dressmakers, it all added up. This is why appearance was such a clear marker of status. Only the wealthy could afford to maintain this level of extravagance. But it wasn't just about wealth, it was also about taste and discernment. Knowing what to wear, how to style your hair, and how to apply your makeup were all signs of good breeding and refined taste. It showed that you were part of the elite, that you understood the rules of the game. And for those who couldn't afford the latest fashions, there were ways to adapt and imitate. Simpler fabrics, less elaborate styles, and homemade cosmetics could all help to create a similar look. But ultimately, appearance was a reflection of your social standing. In conclusion, dress and appearance in 18th century France were much more than just personal style. They were a powerful form of communication, a way to signal status, attract attention, and navigate the complex social landscape. So, the next time you're getting dressed for a date, remember the powdered wigs and panniered skirts of 18th century France, and appreciate the power of appearance in the game of love. And now, let's gently move on. Alright friends, settle in nice and cozy, because now we're going to chat about something super important in 18th century France, something that could totally make or break your shot at romance, family approval. Because believe me, back then, getting hitched wasn't just about finding someone cute you liked. Oh no, it was a family affair, through and through. So, imagine your parents, or maybe even your grandparents, uncles and aunts, having a major say in who you spent the rest of your life with. Kinda intense, right? Family approval was like the ultimate gatekeeper to wedded bliss, especially if you were rolling with the upper crust of society. I mean, we're talking nobility, aristocracy, the whole shebang. These families were all about preserving their social standing, their wealth, and their power. And marriage. Well, marriage was a key strategic tool for achieving all of that. So, they weren't about to let their darling daughter or son run off with just anyone who fluttered their eyelashes. Now were they? Think of it like this. Families had these expectations, these unspoken rules, and these very specific criteria that potential partners had to meet. It wasn't just about, oh, do you like them? It was, does this union benefit us? Does it solidify our position? Does it bring something valuable to the table? One of the biggest things families looked at was lineage. I mean, were you from a good family? Did your ancestors have impressive titles? Did they have a history of, being important and influential? Because marrying someone with a questionable family tree could seriously tarnish the reputation of the whole clan. It was all about maintaining that pure, untainted bloodline. A bit dramatic, maybe, but that's how they rolled. Next up was wealth. I mean, let's be real, money talks, and it definitely talked in 18th century France. Families wanted to make sure that their children were marrying into financial security, or even better, that they were gaining wealth through the marriage. Think of it like a business transaction, but with a little bit of romance sprinkled on top, maybe. Dowries played a huge role here, with the bride's family providing a substantial sum of money, land or other assets to the groom's family. It was all about balancing the scales and ensuring a financially stable future for both parties.
Social standing? Oh, that was crucial. Families wanted their children to marry someone who was at least on par with them socially, or even better, someone who could elevate their social standing. Marrying into the royal court, for example, was like hitting the jackpot. But even if you weren't aiming for royalty, marrying someone with connections to powerful people was a major win. It meant access to influence, opportunities, and all sorts of social perks. But it wasn't just about what the other family had. It was also about their reputation. Were they known for being honorable and respectable? Did they have any scandals lurking in their past? Because a family with a tarnished reputation could bring shame and disgrace to the entire clan. So families were super careful to vet potential partners and make sure they were squeaky clean, at least on the surface. Okay, so what happened if your parents didn't approve of your chosen sweetheart? Well, things could get pretty tricky. I mean, we're talking serious family drama. Parents had a lot of power back then, and they weren't afraid to use it. They could withhold their blessing, which could make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get married. They could pressure you, manipulate you, even threaten to disinherit you if you didn't fall in line. It was intense. Sometimes young lovers would try to elope, running off to get married in secret. But that was a risky move, especially for women. If a woman married without her parents' consent, she could lose her inheritance, her social standing, and even her reputation. It was a tough choice to make. Now, of course, there were exceptions to the rule. Sometimes love did conquer all, and parents would eventually come around and give their blessing. But that usually happened when the potential partner had something really valuable to offer, like a title, wealth, or important connections. Or if the parents were just tired of arguing. So how did young people navigate these tricky waters? Well, they had to be strategic, they had to be charming, they had to be really good at playing the game. Courting rituals were all about winning over the family, as much as they were about winning over the object of your affection. You had to be polite, respectful, and demonstrate that you were a suitable match, not just for their child, but for the entire family. Letters were a huge part of this. Writing eloquent, heartfelt letters to the parents, expressing your admiration for their family and your intentions toward their child, could go a long way. Visits were also important, showing up at family gatherings, engaging in witty conversation, and generally making a good impression. Basically, it was like a never-ending job interview, but with higher stakes and more powdered wigs. And let's not forget the role of matchmakers. These were professional relationship brokers who specialized in finding suitable partners for their clients, taking into account family expectations and social considerations. They were like the real estate agents of the marriage market, helping families navigate the complex terrain and find the perfect property, a partner. So family approval in 18th century France was a big deal. It was a complex dance of social expectations, strategic alliances, and sometimes just maybe, a little bit of love. It shaped the way people courted, the way they married, and even the way they lived their lives. It might seem a little intense and old-fashioned to us today, but it was a reality for people back then, and it's important to understand if we want to truly grasp what dating was like in those days. Now, wasn't that just fascinating? Next time we'll explore the role of dowries and marriage contracts, because securing your future was just as crucial as securing that family approval. Until then, sweet dreams and happy thoughts. Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to delve into a topic that's not exactly the stuff of fairy tales, but oh so crucial to understanding the realities of 18th century French dating, dowries and marriage contracts. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Yawn. Legal documents and financial negotiations. But trust me, this is where things get really interesting. Because these weren't just dry, boring agreements. They were the very foundations upon which marriages, and therefore families' fortunes and social standing, were built. Think of it this way: in a society obsessed with status, lineage, and securing the future, marriage wasn't just about love. I mean, sometimes it was, bless their hearts, but more often than not, it was a strategic alliance, a business deal, a way to consolidate power, and ensure the continuation of the family name and wealth. And that's where dowries and marriage contracts came in. So what exactly was a dowry? In its simplest form, it was the property, money and goods that a bride brought to her marriage. It was her contribution, her share, so to speak, of the marital pot. Now, the size of the dowry was everything. It was a direct reflection of the bride's family's wealth, status, and their hopes for her future happiness. A larger dowry meant a more attractive bride, more eligible suitors, and a greater likelihood of a comfortable and secure life. For aristocratic families, dowries could be absolutely astronomical. We're talking vast estates, glittering jewels, and enough gold to make your eyes water. But even among the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, a respectable dowry was essential. It might include a substantial sum of money, valuable household linens, furniture, and perhaps even a business or trade that the bride could bring into the marriage. Now, here's where it gets a bit complex. The dowry wasn't simply handed over to the groom to do with as he pleased. Oh no. It was carefully managed, protected, and governed by the marriage contract. Think of the contract as the instruction manual, the terms and conditions, the fine print that dictated exactly how the dowry would be used, and what would happen to it in various circumstances. Marriage contracts were incredibly detailed documents, meticulously drafted by lawyers and notaries. They specified everything: the amount of the dowry, the form in which it would be paid, cash, land, goods, the rights and responsibilities of both husband and wife concerning the dowry, and what would happen to it in the event of the husband's death, divorce though rare, or even bankruptcy. One of the key purposes of the marriage contract was to protect the wife's financial interests. It ensured that the dowry remained her separate property, even within the marriage. The husband typically had the right to manage the dowry and use its income to support the household, but he couldn't simply squander it or sell it off without her consent. In many cases, the contract stipulated that if the husband died before the wife, the dowry would be returned to her, providing her with a financial safety net for widowhood. The marriage contract also addressed the issue of inheritance. It specified how the couple's property, including the dowry, would be divided among their children. This was particularly important for aristocratic families, as it ensured the continuation of the family line and the preservation of their wealth. The contracts often favored male heirs, but they also made provisions for daughters, ensuring that they received a portion of the inheritance, often in the form of a dowry, to help them secure their own advantageous marriages. But let's not pretend it was all sunshine and roses. Now, the dowry system, while providing some protection for women, could also be incredibly unfair and restrictive. For women from poorer families, the lack of a substantial dowry could severely limit their marriage prospects. They might be forced to marry much older men, men of lower social standing, or even remain unmarried altogether. The pressure to secure a decent dowry could be immense, leading to financial strain and even desperation for families struggling to make ends meet. And even with a marriage contract in place, women weren't always entirely protected. A husband who was determined to mismanage or squander the dowry could often find ways to do so, despite the legal restrictions. And in a society where men held most of the power, women often lacked the legal and social resources to effectively challenge their husbands' actions. Furthermore, the focus on dowries could perpetuate a view of women as commodities, their worth measured by their financial contributions to the marriage. This could reinforce gender inequality and limit women's opportunities outside of marriage. After all, if a woman's primary purpose was to bring a valuable dowry to the marriage table, then her education, skills and personal ambitions might be seen as less important. Despite these drawbacks, dowries and marriage contracts played a vital role in shaping 18th-century French society. They provided a framework for marriage, secured the financial future of families, and helped to maintain the social order. They weren't always fair, and they certainly weren't always romantic, but they were an integral part of the dating and marriage landscape. So, the next time you're watching a period drama set in 18th-century France, pay close attention to the dowries and marriage contracts. Because beneath the powdered wigs and elegant gowns, those documents were often the real power brokers, quietly shaping the destinies of individuals and families alike. And with that, maybe it's time for a little nap, don't you think? Marriage in 18th-century France, a contract, a performance, and often, a gilded cage. Now, let's gently tiptoe into the boudoirs and back alleys of the era, where infidelity and affairs thrived, painting a complex picture of marriage, desire, and societal expectations. See, for many, marriage wasn't about love, it was about consolidating wealth, securing titles, and ensuring lineage. Romance, well, that was often considered a delightful extra, shall we say. This created a rather flexible understanding of marital fidelity, particularly amongst the aristocracy. Infidelity wasn't just a personal failing, it was woven into the very fabric of courtly life. It was a game, a dance, a way to climb the social ladder, or simply to alleviate the boredom that could come with a loveless union. The pursuit of pleasure, often outside the bonds of matrimony, became an art form. Now, let's not paint everyone with the same brush. There were certainly couples who found genuine affection and remained faithful, but they were often the exception, not the rule, especially within the upper echelons of society. For many, the social and economic pressures of marriage left little room for authentic emotional connection. For men, affairs were often viewed with a wink and a nod, a sign of virility, a testament to their charm and power. A discreet mistress was almost a status symbol. To not have one, well, it might raise eyebrows, suggest a lack of vigor. Of course, discretion was key. One didn't want to openly flaunt one's indiscretions and risk scandal, but a certain je ne sais quoi was often tolerated. The situation for women, however, was far more precarious. A husband's infidelity might be accepted, even expected, but a wife's, oh la la, that was a different story altogether. A woman caught in an affair risked social ruin, public humiliation, and even confinement to a convent. The infamous lettre de cachet,
A sealed letter from the king could be used to imprison a woman accused of adultery, often at the behest of her husband or family, without trial or recourse. This blatant double standard reflected the patriarchal structure of 18th-century French society. A woman's virtue was seen as essential to maintaining the integrity of the family line and ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. An adulterous wife threatened this stability, casting doubt on paternity and potentially jeopardizing inheritance. Of course, despite the risks, women did engage in affairs, sometimes out of genuine desire, sometimes as a means of asserting their agency in a world that often denied them control. For some, it was a way to find the love and passion that was missing from their arranged marriages. And for others, well, perhaps it was simply a thrilling adventure. The most skilled players in this game of love and deception were the courtesans. These women, often highly educated and incredibly charming, held immense power and influence. They were not merely prostitutes, they were skilled conversationalists, patrons of the arts, and confidants to powerful men. Figures like Madame de Pompadour, mistress of King Louis XV, wielded considerable political influence and shaped the cultural landscape of the era. Courtesans understood the art of seduction, the power of suggestion, and the importance of discretion. They navigated the complex social currents of the court with finesse, amassing wealth and prestige along the way. They were often independent women, carving out their own destinies in a society that offered limited opportunities for female advancement. Now, let's not forget the role of religion. The Catholic Church, while influential, often turned a blind eye to the affairs of the aristocracy, as long as appearances were maintained. Public displays of piety could often mask private indulgences. Confession offered a convenient way to absolve sins, allowing individuals to continue their amorous pursuits with a clear conscience, at least, until the next transgression. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and individual liberty, also played a role in shaping attitudes towards infidelity. Some intellectuals questioned the traditional constraints of marriage, arguing for greater freedom of choice and expression, both within and outside of wedlock. However, these progressive ideas were often confined to intellectual circles and did little to change the prevailing social norms. The consequences of infidelity could be severe, especially for women. A husband could seek legal separation, often with the support of his family. The adulterous wife might be stripped of her property rights, denied access to her children, and ostracized from society. In extreme cases, a husband might even resort to violence, though this was generally frowned upon, unless the transgression was particularly egregious. Affairs thrived in this era of arranged marriages and societal pressures. Love letters were exchanged in secret, clandestine meetings were arranged in gardens and secluded apartments, and entire networks of accomplices, servants, confidants, even family members, were enlisted to help conceal these forbidden romances. It was a world of whispered promises, stolen kisses, and the constant threat of exposure. Ultimately, infidelity in 18th-century France reflects the complex interplay between personal desires and societal expectations. It was a product of a system that often prioritized power, property, and lineage over love and emotional fulfillment. While it certainly caused pain and suffering, it also provided an outlet for individual expression and a challenge to the rigid social norms of the era. And as we gently close this chapter, let's move on to the intriguing world of the court of Versailles, where love and intrigue danced hand in hand. Friends, let's slip away for a moment into the glittering heart of 18th-century France, the court at Versailles. Imagine, if you will, a place of unparalleled opulence, a stage where affairs of state mingle with affairs of the heart, all under the watchful eye of the king. It's within these gilded walls that love, or rather the pursuit of it, takes on a unique and often treacherous form. Versailles, more than just a palace, it was the center of power, influence, and ultimately, a breeding ground for both genuine affection and calculated manipulation. To be at court was to be at the epicenter of everything. Your social standing, your wealth, your very future, could be made or broken by the alliances you forged, and the favor you garnered. And in a society where marriage was so often a strategic alliance, love became a game of calculated risks and rewards. The king, of course, set the tone. His own romantic liaisons, whether discreet or highly public, dictated the ebb and flow of courtly life. The king's mistress held significant power, influencing appointments, securing favors, and generally weaving her way into the political fabric of the nation. Think of Madame de Pompadour, for instance, or Madame du Barry. These women were not merely pretty faces, they were astute, intelligent, and knew precisely how to wield their influence to advance their own positions and those of their allies. And so, the courtiers, ever eager to emulate their sovereign, followed suit. Marriage vows were often treated as more of a formality, a necessary step in securing lineage and fortune, rather than a sacred bond built on unwavering devotion. Extramarital affairs were rampant, accepted, and even expected, provided they were conducted with a degree of discretion, of course. Scandal could ruin a reputation, but a well-managed affair could enhance it, proving one's charm, wit, and social prowess. The pursuit of a lover at Versailles was a complex dance, a delicate balance of flirtation, intrigue, and careful calculation. Letters, often scented and exquisitely penned, were exchanged in secret, carried by trusted servants or intermediaries. Visits to private chambers were arranged with the utmost secrecy, requiring elaborate schemes and carefully orchestrated alibis. Gifts, naturally, played a crucial role. Lavish jewels, embroidered silks, and other extravagant tokens of affection were offered as incentives and declarations of intent. But these gifts were not always what they seemed. They could be used to signify genuine affection, or they could be employed as strategic tools to gain leverage over a potential lover, or even to expose a rival. Gossip, the lifeblood of Versailles, was a powerful weapon. A well-placed rumor could destroy a reputation, end an affair, or elevate a courtier's standing in the eyes of the king. Maintaining a network of informants, individuals who could provide invaluable insights into the secret lives of others, was essential for anyone hoping to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly love. The queen, often an outsider in this world of French intrigue, held her own unique position. While the king's mistresses might wield considerable power, the queen remained the symbol of legitimacy, the mother of the heir, and a figure of considerable influence in her own right. The queen's romantic life, whether real or rumored, was always a subject of intense scrutiny and speculation, a source of endless gossip and intrigue. Love at Versailles, therefore, was rarely simple. It was a game of power, status and survival, played out under the bright lights of the chandeliers and the ever-watchful eyes of the court. Genuine affection could blossom amidst the intrigue, but it was often overshadowed by ambition, jealousy, and the constant struggle for advancement. And the consequences of a misstep could be devastating. A failed affair could lead to social ostracism, financial ruin, or even exile from the court. A careless indiscretion could expose one's secrets to enemies, providing them with ammunition to destroy a reputation or undermine a political alliance. But despite the risks, the game continued. The allure of power, the thrill of the chase, and the sheer excitement of life at Versailles proved too irresistible for many to resist. They were willing to risk everything for a chance at love, or at least, for a chance at the rewards that love could bring. Consider the story of the Chevalier for example, a fascinating figure who lived a life of intrigue and mystery. Diane, a diplomat, spy, and soldier, was known for their exceptional intelligence and courage. But it was their ambiguous gender identity that truly captivated the court. Diane lived as both a man and a woman at different times in their life, a secret that gave them access to circles that would otherwise have been closed off. Their romantic entanglements were complex and scandalous, a reflection of the fluidity and ambiguity that often characterized love at Versailles. Or think of the many artists and musicians who sought patronage from wealthy courtiers. For them, a romantic liaison could mean financial security, artistic freedom, and access to the highest circles of society. The line between love and patronage blurred, with artists often using their talent and charm to cultivate relationships with powerful patrons, securing their support and protection. Versailles, in essence, was a microcosm of 18th-century French society, magnified and intensified. The same social pressures, economic realities, and power dynamics that shaped the lives of ordinary people were present at court, but with far higher stakes. Love, therefore, was not simply a matter of personal inclination. It was a strategic tool, a means of navigating a complex and often dangerous world. So, as you drift off tonight, remember the halls of Versailles, and perhaps whisper a thank you that your modern dating life may not involve quite so much calculating, subterfuge. Alright, settle in, friends. It's time to explore the rather serious, yet ultimately fascinating, world of religious considerations in 18th-century France, specifically, how they intertwined with marriage, morality, and the rigid social norms of the time. Now, breathe deeply, and let's gently unpack this. Religion, particularly Catholicism, exerted an all-encompassing influence on French society. It wasn't just about attending mass, it was woven into the very fabric of daily life, dictating acceptable behavior, influencing laws, and shaping social expectations, especially when it came to relationships and marriage. Marriage, you see, was considered a sacrament, a holy union ordained by God. The Catholic Church held significant sway over marriage laws and practices. Divorce, for instance, was virtually impossible. Annulments could sometimes be obtained, but only under very specific, and usually rather convoluted circumstances, such as proof of consanguinity, meaning the couple were too closely related, or if one party could demonstrate coercion or lack of consent at the time of the marriage. Think of it like this: once you were in, you were really in. This made the choice of a marriage partner an incredibly weighty decision, far more than just a matter of personal affection, as important as that may have been. Families, naturally, played a dominant role in arranging marriages, ensuring that alliances aligned with their social standing, financial interests, and familial ambitions. Parental approval was absolutely paramount, and disregarding their wishes could result in social ostracization, or even disinheritance. Now, let's tiptoe into the realm of morality. The Church's teachings on chastity and marital fidelity were, at least officially, rigorously enforced. Premarital sex was strictly forbidden, and adultery was considered a grave sin, carrying significant social repercussions, especially for women. A woman caught committing adultery could face public humiliation, legal separation, and the loss of her social standing. Men, while subject to the same religious condemnation, often faced far less severe social penalties. I know, it's a tale as old as time. This discrepancy highlights the pervasive double standard that governed sexual morality in 18th-century France. Men, particularly those of the aristocracy, were often afforded considerable leeway in their extramarital affairs, provided they maintained a degree of discretion and upheld their social obligations. A mistress, or maîtresse en titre, could even become a semi-official figure in a nobleman's life, wielding considerable influence at court and within society. It's a complicated, and often rather hypocritical situation. However, even for men, flagrant disregard for religious and moral norms could have consequences. Public scandal could damage their reputation and undermine their political standing, especially if it involved mistreating their wives or neglecting their familial duties. The Church, while sometimes turning a blind eye to discreet indiscretions, could also wield its moral authority to condemn particularly egregious behavior. Social norms, heavily influenced by religious teachings, dictated acceptable behavior in courtship and relationships. Public displays of affection were generally frowned upon, and interactions between unmarried men and women were carefully chaperoned, especially among the upper classes. Courtship rituals, such as exchanging letters, paying visits, and attending social gatherings, were governed by strict protocols designed to maintain decorum and prevent scandal. The Church also played a significant role in regulating social behavior through its pronouncements on modesty, dress, and entertainment. Sumptuary laws, although increasingly difficult to enforce, attempted to restrict extravagant displays of wealth and regulate clothing styles, reflecting a concern with maintaining social hierarchies and preventing moral decay. Theaters and other forms of entertainment were often subject to censorship and moral scrutiny, reflecting the Church's desire to control public discourse and uphold traditional values. However, it's important to remember that despite the Church's pervasive influence, 18th-century France was also a society grappling with new ideas and changing attitudes. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, individual liberty, and secularism, challenged traditional religious authority and promoted alternative perspectives on morality and human relationships. These Enlightenment ideals percolated through society, influencing attitudes towards marriage, love, and social norms. While the Church continued to uphold traditional doctrines, some individuals began to question the sanctity of arranged marriages and advocate for unions based on mutual affection and personal choice. Philosophical treatises and literary works explored alternative models of love and relationships, challenging the rigid constraints of traditional morality. The rise of salons, intellectual gatherings hosted by influential women, provided spaces for these new ideas to be discussed and debated. Salons offered opportunities for men and women to interact on a more equal footing, fostering intellectual exchange and challenging traditional social hierarchies. These spaces became incubators for new perspectives on love, marriage, and the role of women in society. Furthermore, the very structure of French society, with its emphasis on courtly life and aristocratic privilege, created opportunities for deviation from religious norms. The pursuit of pleasure and the cultivation of personal relationships often took precedence over strict adherence to moral codes. The court at Versailles, with its atmosphere of intrigue, ambition and social competition, became a breeding ground for scandalous affairs and illicit relationships. In essence, religion in 18th-century France presented a complex and often contradictory landscape. While the Catholic Church wielded considerable power and influence, its authority was increasingly challenged by Enlightenment ideals and the realities of courtly life. Marriage remained a sacrament, but the emphasis on familial alliances and social advancement often overshadowed personal affection. Morality was preached but frequently disregarded, especially among the upper classes. Social norms dictated acceptable behavior, but opportunities for deviation and transgression abounded. So, as you drift off to sleep, consider the delicate dance between faith, desire, and social expectation in 18th-century France. It was a time of rigid rules and quiet rebellions, of sacred vows and whispered secrets. It was a world where religion shaped every facet of life, even as new ideas threatened to unravel the very fabric of tradition. Sleep tight. Alright then, gather round, as we gently drift into another corner of 18th-century French life. Now, imagine a world without the distractions of our modern age, a world where conversation and intellectual exchange were highly valued, and where matters of the heart and mind often intertwined. This brings us to the rise of salons, a comforting thought. Now, what were these salons exactly? Think of them as living rooms, but for ideas. They were gatherings, usually held in the homes of wealthy and influential women, where people from all walks of life, though generally from the upper echelons of society, came together to discuss literature, philosophy, politics, and pretty much anything else that piqued their intellectual curiosity. The hostess, or salonier, was the key to it all. These women weren't just providing a space, they were actively curating the guest list, steering the conversations, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. They needed to be intelligent, well-read, and socially adept. Quite the balancing act, really, like tending a delicate garden.
Now, who attended these salons? Well, you might find nobles rubbing shoulders with writers, artists debating philosophers, and even the occasional forward-thinking clergyman adding their thoughts. It was a place where social barriers could, at least temporarily, be lowered in the name of intellectual pursuit. Though let's be honest, a marquis wouldn't likely start courting the stable hand. It was all a very delicate and polite affair. What made salons so important? Well, for one thing, they provided a rare space for women to exert influence. In a society where women were largely excluded from formal institutions of power, salons offered a platform to shape cultural and intellectual trends. By choosing the topics of discussion and inviting specific guests, salonier could subtly guide the course of public opinion. It was also a space of relative freedom of speech, at least compared to the heavily censored world outside. While it wasn't exactly a free-for-all, salons allowed for more open debate and discussion than was typically found in the court or in official government settings. Of course, everyone still had to be careful not to cross the line too far and risk the wrath of the authorities. But let's get to the romantic side of things, shall we? Salons were not just centers of intellectual discourse, they were also fertile ground for romantic encounters. Imagine the scene: soft candlelight, elegant surroundings, witty banter filling the air. It's like a recipe for romance, isn't it? The focus on conversation and intellectual compatibility meant that people were drawn to each other not just for their looks or social status, but also for their minds. A shared passion for literature, or a similar philosophical viewpoint, could spark a connection that went beyond mere physical attraction. Think of the possibilities. You might have a young poet reciting his verses, catching the eye of a beautiful and intelligent salonier, or perhaps two philosophers, locked in a heated debate, find themselves drawn to each other's sharp intellect and passionate arguments. The possibilities were as endless as the conversations themselves. Of course, not all romantic encounters in salons led to lasting love. Affairs and flirtations were common, and the complex social dynamics of the time could make relationships quite complicated. But even fleeting encounters could have a significant impact, inspiring art, influencing politics, or simply adding a bit of spice to the lives of those involved. One of the most famous examples of a salonier who wielded both intellectual and romantic power was Madame de Pompadour. Though best known as the mistress of King Louis V, she was also a highly intelligent and influential woman who hosted a popular salon at Versailles. Her salon became a hub for Enlightenment thinkers, artists and writers, and she used her position to promote their ideas and support their work. She was a patron of the arts, a champion of progress, and a woman who understood the power of both the mind and the heart. She was a very interesting and complex character, and her influence extended far beyond the bedroom. Salons also played a significant role in shaping the social skills and etiquette of the time. They were places where people learned how to converse with grace and wit, how to debate respectfully, and how to navigate the complex social rituals of the upper classes. The art of conversation was highly valued, and those who could master it were highly sought after as guests. It wasn't enough to simply be intelligent, you had to be able to express your ideas clearly, engage with others respectfully, and add a touch of charm and wit to the conversation. Salons also helped to promote a more refined and sophisticated culture. By bringing together people from different backgrounds and encouraging them to engage in intellectual exchange, they helped to break down social barriers and foster a sense of shared cultural identity. They contributed to the development of new literary and artistic styles, as writers and artists were exposed to new ideas and influences through their interactions in salons. They helped to shape public opinion, as ideas debated in salons often found their way into the wider world through books, pamphlets and newspapers. The influence of salons began to wane during the French Revolution, as the old social order was overturned and new forms of public discourse emerged. But even though the salons themselves eventually disappeared, their legacy lived on in the intellectual and cultural traditions of France. The emphasis on conversation, intellectual exchange, and the importance of women's voices continued to shape French society for generations to come. So next time you find yourself in a stimulating conversation, remember the salons of 18th century France, and the women who created these spaces for intellectual and romantic exploration. And so we gently reach the end of our little exploration into the world of the salons. I hope it provided a pleasant, peaceful journey. 18th century France, the era of powdered wigs, extravagant balls, and coffee houses. Yes, you heard right. While Versailles and the salons held court for the upper crust, a different kind of social scene was brewing, quite literally, in the public spaces of cities like Paris. These weren't just places to grab a caffeine fix, they were vital hubs for connection, conversation, and you guessed it, courtship. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's explore the delightful world of coffee houses and other public arenas of social interaction. Before we dive into the aromatic depths of the coffee house, let's paint a broader picture of the social landscape. Remember, in 18th century France, opportunities for men and women to mingle freely were somewhat restricted, especially among the upper classes. Strict social protocols governed interactions, and chaperones were often the norm, particularly for young unmarried women of good standing. However, public spaces offered a degree of freedom that was less attainable in private homes or at court. These spaces provided a neutral ground where individuals could encounter each other, observe potential partners, and engage in conversations, all within certain social boundaries, of course. Now let's talk coffee houses. These establishments, which had been gaining popularity since the late 17th century, were much more than just places to get your morning buzz. They were centers of intellectual and social life, often serving as informal meeting places for artists, writers, politicians and merchants. Men primarily frequented these establishments, although some coffee houses did cater to a mixed clientele or had specific hours that were accessible to women. The atmosphere in a typical coffee house was lively and stimulating. Imagine walking into a bustling room filled with the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, the murmur of conversations, and the clinking of cups. Patrons would gather around tables, discussing the latest news, debating philosophical ideas, or simply engaging in light-hearted banter. Newspapers were often available, and some coffee houses even served as informal lending libraries. So how did these spaces facilitate romantic encounters? Well, for men, coffee houses provided an opportunity to observe women from a distance, to gauge their demeanor, their style of dress, and their social connections. A man might strike up a conversation with a female acquaintance or be introduced to someone new by a mutual friend. The relatively relaxed atmosphere of the coffee house made it easier to initiate these interactions than it would have been in a more formal setting. For women, the coffee house offered a chance to be seen and admired. Dressing well, engaging in witty conversation, and displaying one's social graces were all ways to attract attention. While a direct approach from a man might have been considered forward or even inappropriate, a subtle exchange of glances or a carefully crafted remark could be enough to spark interest. Remember, subtlety and nuance were key in the dating game of 18th century France. Of course, coffee houses weren't the only public spaces where social interaction flourished. The parks and gardens of Paris, such as the Tuileries Garden and the Luxembourg Garden, were popular destinations for leisurely strolls and social gatherings. These green spaces offered a more relaxed and open environment than the enclosed confines of a coffee house. Imagine a sunny afternoon in the Tuileries Garden. Couples strolled hand in hand along the shaded paths, while groups of friends gathered on benches to chat and gossip. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, the chirping of birds, and the gentle rustling of leaves. Here a chance encounter could easily blossom into a conversation, and a shared admiration for a beautiful flower or a picturesque view could provide the perfect opening line. The promenades along the boulevards were another popular spot for socializing. These wide tree-lined avenues were ideal for showing off one's fashionable attire and observing the passing scene. Carriages would roll by, carrying elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen, while pedestrians strolled along the sidewalks, exchanging greetings and engaging in casual conversation. A well-placed glance or a subtle smile could be enough to signal romantic interest, and a brief conversation could lead to a more formal acquaintance. The opera and the theatre were also significant venues for social display and potential romantic encounters, but we will delve into those delights later. For now, just think of the coffee houses and public gardens as places that allowed you to be seen and to meet someone new, outside the formal confines of court or the watchful eyes of your family. Beyond these more established spaces, even everyday locations like markets and shops could provide opportunities for social interaction. While these weren't necessarily places to find romance, they did offer a chance to observe people and engage in casual conversation. A shared interest in a particular product or a humorous exchange with a vendor could be enough to break the ice and lead to a more meaningful connection. It's important to remember that social class played a significant role in determining who had access to these public spaces and how they could interact within them. While coffee houses and gardens were open to a wide range of people, certain areas and activities were often restricted to specific social groups. The aristocracy, for example, might frequent certain sections of a park or attend exclusive events that were off-limits to commoners. Despite these social divisions, public spaces offered a degree of social mobility and opportunity that was less attainable in other areas of life. A talented artist or a clever merchant could gain recognition and influence through their interactions in coffee houses and salons, potentially attracting the attention of someone from a higher social class. So, what can we learn from the coffee houses and public spaces of 18th century France? Well, for one thing, we can appreciate the importance of neutral ground in fostering social interaction. These spaces provided a relatively safe and accessible environment where people from different backgrounds could come together, exchange ideas, and form connections. We can also see the enduring human need for connection and community. Despite the strict social protocols and the limited opportunities for interaction, people found ways to connect with each other, to form relationships, and to pursue their romantic desires. And finally, we can appreciate the power of subtlety and nuance in the art of courtship. In a society where directness was often frowned upon, a well-placed glance, a witty remark, or a shared appreciation for beauty could be enough to spark a lasting connection. So the next time you find yourself in a coffee shop, a park, or a public space, take a moment to appreciate the history and the potential for connection that surrounds you. You never know who you might meet, or what kind of romantic adventure might be brewing just around the corner. The theatre and the opera. Imagine, if you will, grand halls bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfumes. It's here, amidst the soaring melodies and dramatic performances, that romance and social display intertwine in the most fascinating ways. In 18th century France, attending the theatre or opera wasn't just about enjoying a show. Oh no. It was a carefully orchestrated performance in itself. It was a chance to see and be seen, to flaunt your wealth and status, and of course to engage in a bit of discreet flirting. Think of it as a very elaborate, very public dating game. The opera in particular held a special allure. It was the pinnacle of artistic expression, a dazzling spectacle that combined music, drama, dance, and elaborate stage design.
But it was also a social hub, a place where the aristocracy and the wealthy bourgeoisie mingled, their every move scrutinized by their peers. Before the show even began, the theatre was abuzz with activity. Elegant carriages lined the streets outside, disgorging their elegantly dressed passengers. Ladies, adorned in their finest gowns and jewels, were escorted by their gentlemen companions, their faces partially concealed by delicate masks. These masks, you see, weren't just for show. They provided a degree of anonymity, allowing for clandestine conversations and flirtatious glances without fear of being immediately recognized. Inside, the theatre was a kaleidoscope of color and movement. The auditorium was typically arranged in tiers of boxes, each offering a prime view of the stage, and more importantly of the other boxes. Securing a good box was crucial, as it served as your personal stage for the evening. It was where you displayed your social standing and your impeccable taste. The performances themselves were often secondary to the social interactions taking place within the boxes. Conversations flowed freely, sometimes drowning out the music on stage. Operas could last for hours, providing ample opportunity for socializing, networking, and of course pursuing romantic interests. A gentleman might use the opera as an opportunity to pay court to a lady he admired. He could send her flowers, sweets, or a discreet note, delivered by a servant. He might engage her in conversation during the intermissions, complimenting her beauty or her taste in music. These interactions, though seemingly innocent, were often loaded with hidden meaning, carefully calculated to test the waters and gauge the other person's interest. The use of opera glasses was also an integral part of the game. While ostensibly used to get a better view of the stage, they were just as often employed to discreetly observe other members of the audience. A lady might use her opera glasses to steal a glance at a handsome gentleman across the room, or to assess the attire of a rival. Gentlemen, in turn, might use their glasses to admire a lady's décolletage, or to identify potential romantic prospects. But it wasn't all about romance, of course. The theatre and opera were also important venues for social and political maneuvering. Alliances were forged, deals were struck, and reputations were made or broken within those gilded walls. The court especially played a powerful role. Attending the theatre or opera became a sign of loyalty and belonging, and could lead to social advancement. The performances therefore were also opportunities to display their allegiance, and perhaps attract the eye of a powerful patron. And of course, let's not forget the fashion. The theatre and opera were prime venues for displaying the latest styles and trends. Ladies spared no expense in acquiring the most fashionable gowns, wigs and accessories. The higher the status, the more elaborate the attire became. These displays of wealth and taste were essential for signaling social standing and attracting potential suitors. Gentlemen, too, paid close attention to their appearance. A well-tailored suit, a fashionable wig, and a perfectly placed jabot were all essential for making a good impression. The key was to strike a balance between elegance and extravagance, showing that you were both wealthy and refined. The theatre and opera also provided a fertile ground for gossip and scandal, because where there is social mingling, there will always be secrets to be revealed. Clandestine affairs, secret rendezvous, and scandalous behavior were all part of the theatre scene. The boxes, with their dim lighting and secluded corners, provided the perfect setting for illicit encounters. Rumors flew like wildfire, and reputations could be ruined with a single whispered word. It's important to remember that all of this took place within a very rigid social framework. The rules of etiquette were strictly enforced, and any breach of decorum could have serious consequences. A lady who was seen talking to the wrong person, or a gentleman who made an inappropriate advance, could quickly find themselves ostracized from polite society. And then there were the consequences of unplanned pregnancies. For women, the loss of reputation could be a total disaster, and it could have lifelong ramifications for women born without the financial means to quietly raise the child. Despite the risks, the lure of the theatre and opera remained strong. It offered a unique opportunity to escape the constraints of everyday life, to indulge in fantasy and spectacle, and to engage in the intoxicating game of love and social advancement. So the next time you find yourself at the theatre or opera, take a moment to imagine yourself transported back to 18th and picture the glittering chandeliers, the elaborate costumes, and the hushed whispers of intrigue. And remember, beneath the surface of artistic expression lies a complex web of social dynamics, romantic aspirations, and carefully calculated performances. Because, even though there is music and dancing, the game is truly always afoot. Alright, settle in, friends, and let's gently drift into a world of powdered wigs and whispered secrets, because tonight we're diving deep into the art of seduction in 18th century France. Forget swiping right or sliding into DMs. Back then, landing a date was a delicate dance, a carefully orchestrated ballet of words, glances, and strategic social maneuvering. This was a world where reputation was everything, and a single misstep could ruin your chances faster than you can say bonjour. So, how did these charming individuals actually do it? What were the strategies and tactics they employed in the pursuit of love, or shall we say amour? First off, understanding the social landscape was absolutely crucial. We're talking about a highly structured society, with rigid rules dictating who could interact with whom, and under what circumstances. Think of it like a very elaborate game of chess, where every move had to be carefully considered. The key was to find ways to circumvent these restrictions, to create opportunities for intimate encounters, while still adhering to the basic rules of propriety. And trust me, they were masters of finding those loopholes. One of the most common tactics, especially for men pursuing women, was the art of low regard, the meaningful glance. This wasn't just a quick look, it was a lingering gaze, full of unspoken promises and hints of deeper emotions. Think of it as a non-verbal love letter, delivered directly to the eyes. But of course you couldn't just stare endlessly, that would be considered rude, even aggressive. The trick was to catch their eye, hold their gaze for a moment, and then gently look away, leaving them wondering what you were thinking. The implication was that you were deeply impressed, a feeling no one disliked, after all. Then there were the strategic placements in social settings. This was all about positioning yourself in a way that allowed for frequent, yet seemingly accidental, encounters. A gentleman might accidentally bump into a lady at the opera, or coincidentally find himself strolling through the same garden. These encounters were always brief, always polite, but they were enough to establish a connection, a sense of familiarity. It was like planting seeds of interest that could blossom later on. And speaking of connections, the art of conversation was absolutely essential. This wasn't just about exchanging pleasantries, it was about showcasing your wit, your intelligence, and your charm. You had to be able to engage in intelligent discussions on a wide range of topics, from philosophy and literature to art and politics. This period of history produced conversationalists that were legendary. But it wasn't just about being smart. You also had to be a good listener, showing genuine interest in what the other person had to say. People were flattered to be listened to. The goal was to create a sense of intellectual intimacy, a feeling that you truly understood each other. For women, the art of conversation could be even more important. They were often limited in their social opportunities, so they had to make the most of every encounter. A woman who was witty, intelligent, and well-read was considered a highly desirable match. And let's not forget the power of flattery. A well-placed compliment could go a long way, especially if it was sincere and specific. Instead of simply saying "you look beautiful," a suitor might say something like, "The way the candlelight catches the color in your eyes is simply captivating." Of course, the line between flattery and insincerity was a fine one. Too much flattery could come across as desperate or manipulative. The trick was to strike a balance, offering genuine compliments while still maintaining a sense of composure. Letters also played a crucial role in the art of seduction. These weren't just quick notes, they were carefully crafted works of art, filled with poetic language, elegant prose, and subtle expressions of admiration. A letter might begin with a polite inquiry about the recipient's health, followed by a description of some beautiful scene or inspiring thought. Then, almost casually, it would transition into expressions of personal admiration, praising their beauty, their wit, or their kindness. The key was to be subtle, to avoid being too direct or forward. The goal was to hint at your feelings, to pique their interest without revealing too much too soon. The most skillful writers could convey a world of emotion with just a few carefully chosen words. And let's not forget the importance of gifts. A carefully chosen present could be a powerful symbol of affection, especially if it was something personal and meaningful. A gentleman might give a lady a book of poetry, a delicate piece of jewelry, or a bouquet of flowers that symbolized their feelings. The gift itself wasn't as important as the thought behind it, the message it conveyed. But perhaps the most important tactic of all was the art of patience. Seduction in 18th century France wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. It required time, dedication, and a willingness to play the long game. You had to be willing to court them for months, even years, before they finally agreed to a more serious commitment. And even then, there were no guarantees. Social standards of the time were very strict, and you had to follow them carefully. This wasn't for the faint of heart, of course. It required a great deal of self-control, resilience, and a genuine appreciation for the art of the chase. But for those who were willing to put in the effort, the rewards could be immeasurable. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can learn from the art of seduction in 18th century France. It wasn't just about getting what you wanted, it was about building a connection, creating a sense of intimacy, and appreciating the beauty of the human heart. So, next time you're trying to woo someone, remember the lessons of the past, take your time, be patient, and focus on building a genuine connection. You might be surprised at what you discover. After all, the timeless art of seduction is all about showing the best version of yourself to the world, in the hopes that the person you admire sees that too, in you. The double standard, a concept as old as time itself, flourished with particular vigor in 18th century France. Expectations for men and women in relationships, both before and during marriage, were vastly different, often reflecting and reinforcing the existing power imbalances of the social structure. For women, virtue was paramount. A woman's reputation was her most prized possession, carefully guarded by her family, and crucial for securing a suitable marriage. Virginity before marriage was non-negotiable for women of the aristocracy, and even for those of the rising bourgeoisie. Any hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's prospects, making her unmarriageable and bringing shame upon her family. Men, on the other hand, faced significantly less scrutiny. While a man's reputation was certainly important, especially concerning his financial standing and social connections, his sexual exploits before marriage were often overlooked, even expected. It was not uncommon for young men of the aristocracy to engage in affairs with actresses, dancers, or even women of the lower classes. These dalliances were often seen as a rite of passage, a sign of their virility and social status. Provided these affairs were discreet and did not result in scandal that threatened the family name, they were generally tolerated. The idea was that men were naturally inclined towards such pursuits, and it was a woman's role to remain pure and untainted until marriage. This disparity in expectations stemmed from the importance placed on legitimate heirs. A woman's fidelity was crucial to ensure that any children she bore were undeniably the offspring of her husband, thus guaranteeing the proper inheritance of property and titles. A man's infidelity, while frowned upon, did not pose the same threat to the lineage as illegitimate children, while sometimes acknowledged, rarely held the same legal rights. This double standard extended into marriage as well. Women were expected to be faithful, obedient, and devoted to their husbands. Their primary role was to manage the household, raise children, and maintain the family's social standing. Infidelity on the part of a woman was considered a grave offense, punishable by social ostracism, and in some cases, even legal repercussions. Adultery could provide grounds for divorce, which, while rare, would irrevocably ruin a woman's reputation and future prospects. Men, however, enjoyed considerably more freedom within the confines of marriage. While fidelity was ideally encouraged, it was often not strictly enforced, particularly within the higher echelons of society. Affairs were commonplace, and often conducted with a degree of openness that would be unthinkable for women. These affairs were often seen as a perk of their social status and power, provided they were conducted discreetly and did not openly flaunt their infidelity. They were often tolerated by their wives, who understood that this was simply the way of the world. The reasons behind this tolerance were complex. For one, women often lacked the economic independence to leave their husbands, even in cases of blatant infidelity. Divorce was difficult to obtain, and even if granted, would leave a woman socially vulnerable and financially destitute. Staying in the marriage, despite the humiliation, often provided the only means of security in social standing for both the woman and her children. Furthermore, the social structure often incentivized women to turn a blind eye to their husbands' indiscretions. A wife's social standing was directly tied to her husband's, and any scandal that tarnished his reputation would also reflect poorly on her. Maintaining the facade of a happy and successful marriage was often considered more important than personal happiness or satisfaction. In some cases, women even benefited from their husbands' affairs, gaining social advantages or financial favors from the mistresses. The court of Versailles, with its intricate web of alliances and intrigues, served as a breeding ground for this double standard. Affairs were rampant, and often used as tools for political maneuvering and social advancement. Mistresses held considerable power and influence, often acting as unofficial advisors to the king, and wielding considerable sway over courtly life.
The concept of amour courtois, or courtly love, further complicated the dynamics of relationships. While it idealized romantic love and devotion, it often existed outside the bounds of marriage. Men were expected to engage in elaborate displays of affection towards women who were not their wives, often treating them with more respect and admiration than they showed their own spouses. This created a paradoxical situation where men could publicly profess their love for someone other than their wives, while still expecting absolute fidelity from them. Enlightenment ideas, which emphasized reason, equality, and individual rights, began to challenge the traditional double standard, though changes were slow and gradual. Some philosophers and writers argued for greater equality between men and women, advocating for equal rights in marriage and education. These ideas, however, were largely confined to intellectual circles and did not immediately translate into widespread social change. Despite the pervasive double standard, some women found ways to navigate and challenge the existing power structures. Through their wit, intelligence, and social connections, they exerted influence and carved out spaces for themselves within a patriarchal society. Salons, hosted by influential women, provided a forum for intellectual discourse and challenged the traditional dominance of men in intellectual life. Women also used their positions as mistresses to gain political power and influence, using their connections to benefit their families and further their own ambitions. The expectations for men and women in relationships in 18th-century France were starkly unequal, reflecting and reinforcing the power imbalances of the time. While men enjoyed considerable freedom and social acceptance of their indiscretions, women were held to a much higher standard of virtue and fidelity. This double standard, though gradually challenged by Enlightenment ideas, remained a dominant force in shaping the dynamics of relationships and the lives of women in 18th-century France. The consequences were significant, influencing everything from marriage prospects and social standing to personal freedom and happiness. Ah yes, friends, as we softly glide along in our exploration of 18th-century France, we now arrive at a rather sensitive, often hushed-over topic: illegitimacy and bastardy. It's a phrase laden with societal weight, isn't it? Just let those words settle over you like a comforting blanket. Illegitimacy, bastardy. And what did it really mean to be born outside of wedlock in this era? What trials did these innocent babes and their mothers have to endure? Well, prepare to settle in and find out as we take a closer look at what it really meant. In the rigidly structured society of 18th-century France, being born en dehors du mariage or outside of marriage carried significant and often devastating consequences, particularly for the women involved. Let's just let that sink in, shall we? Devastating consequences. Imagine a world where a single misstep could alter the entire trajectory of your life, where a moment of affection, a secret tryst, could lead to complete and utter ruin. For an unmarried woman, pregnancy was a social catastrophe of the highest order. It immediately and irrevocably compromised her reputation, which, as we've discussed previously, was a woman's most valuable asset. Her chances of making a respectable marriage, the primary path to security and social standing, plummeted. She became a pariah, whispered about, ostracized, often forced out of her family home and community. The gentle sibilance of societal judgment, like a cold draught through a draughty manor, whispering, whispering. The severity of the consequences depended largely on her social class. For aristocratic women, an illegitimate pregnancy was a scandal that threatened the family's lineage and reputation. While discreet arrangements could sometimes be made, a quick marriage to a lower-ranking nobleman, a quiet retreat to a convent, the stigma remained. Think of it as a stain, impossible to completely remove, no matter how hard you scrub, a dark mark on the family escutcheon. For women of the middle class, the consequences were equally dire, though perhaps less publicly visible. They risked losing their social standing, their livelihoods, and their families' support. Opportunities for employment were limited for women in general, and an unmarried mother faced even greater obstacles. Needlework perhaps, or service as a laundress, a life of relentless toil, with the constant burden of societal disapproval. But it was for the women of the lower classes that the consequences were often the most brutal. Poor women, already vulnerable and marginalized, faced destitution and starvation. With no financial resources and limited options for work, many turned to desperate measures, such as begging, prostitution, or even infanticide, a heartbreakingly common and tragic response to impossible circumstances. We just think of the sheer desperation, the feeling of being utterly trapped, with no way out, no helping hand. And what of the child, born under such inauspicious circumstances? An illegitimate child, often referred to as a bastard, faced a life of social and legal disadvantage. They were typically denied inheritance rights, excluded from respectable society, and stigmatized for the circumstances of their birth. It was as if they were born with a shadow hanging over them, a constant reminder of their illegitimate status. The legal status of illegitimate children varied depending on the region and the prevailing customs. In some areas they could be legitimized if their parents subsequently married. In others they remained legally excluded from the family, even if acknowledged by their father. Regardless of the legal technicalities, they invariably faced social discrimination and prejudice. The sting of the word bastard, it lingered, didn't it? Like a bad taste in one's mouth. The Church also played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward illegitimacy. The Catholic Church, the dominant religious force in 18th-century France, condemned premarital sex and viewed illegitimate children as a product of sin. While the Church offered some limited forms of support for unmarried mothers and illegitimate children, its overall stance contributed to the social stigma surrounding illegitimacy. The weight of religious judgment, bearing down like a heavy cloud, one of the most common responses to an illegitimate pregnancy was abandonment. Unmarried mothers, desperate to escape social disgrace and financial ruin, often abandoned their babies at foundling hospitals. These institutions, run by the church or charitable organizations, provided a refuge for abandoned children, but the conditions were often harsh, and the mortality rates were high. A desperate act of love, born of despair, a heartbreaking choice, with no easy answers. The foundling hospitals, though intended as a haven, were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of abandoned children. Resources were stretched thin, and the staff struggled to provide adequate care. Many babies died from malnutrition, disease, or neglect. The cries of countless infants, echoing through the halls, a constant reminder of the human cost of illegitimacy. Those children who survived faced an uncertain future. Some were adopted by families willing to take them in. Others remained in the foundling hospital, learning a trade or skill that would enable them to earn a living. But for many, the stigma of their illegitimate birth continued to haunt them throughout their lives. The fathers of illegitimate children often escaped social censure, particularly if they were wealthy or powerful. While they might be legally obligated to provide some financial support for the child, they rarely faced the same level of social ostracism as the mothers. This blatant double standard reflected the deeply ingrained patriarchal values of 18th-century French society. A world where men could act with impunity, while women bore the brunt of societal judgment. A world where the scales of justice were heavily weighted in favor of the male sex. Over time, attitudes toward illegitimacy began to shift, albeit slowly. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and individual rights led some to question the harsh treatment of unmarried mothers and illegitimate children. Reformers advocated for legal reforms that would provide greater protection for these vulnerable members of society. However, the stigma surrounding illegitimacy remained deeply entrenched throughout the 18th century. It would take the social and political upheaval of the French Revolution to bring about more significant changes in attitudes and laws. But that, my friends, is a tale for another time. So, as we slowly stir from this somber exploration, let's remember the countless women and children who suffered the consequences of illegitimacy in 18th century France. May their stories serve as a reminder of the importance of compassion, understanding, and social justice. And with that, dear listeners, drift gently into the realms of slumber. May your dreams be filled with kindness and gentle light. Our friends, now we arrive at a pivotal crossroads in our exploration of love and courtship in 18th century France. It's a matter of tradition versus individual desire, the age-old question of arranged marriages versus love matches. As you settle in, let's gently untangle the threads of these contrasting approaches, each woven deeply into the fabric of French society. For centuries, the bedrock of aristocratic and even bourgeois marriage was the mariage de convenance, the marriage of convenience. These weren't necessarily loveless unions, mind you, but love was, well, it was often considered a happy bonus, not the primary requirement. The real requirements, things like securing family alliances, consolidating wealth, maintaining social standing, and ensuring the continuation of the family line. Think of it as a business transaction, really, with hearts taking a backseat to, say, property deeds. Parents, particularly fathers, held immense power in these arrangements. They meticulously assessed potential partners for their children, weighing factors like family name, fortune, and social connections. Daughters, especially, had little say in the matter. Their duty was to obey their parents and accept the husband chosen for them, bringing with them a hefty dowry that would further solidify the union's financial benefits. It was a young woman's duty to her family, a sacrifice often made for the greater good, or at least what the family perceived as the greater good. Sons had a bit more leeway, especially if they were the eldest and stood to inherit the family estate.
They might be consulted on potential matches, but ultimately, the decision still rested with their parents. After all, a poor match could jeopardize the family's future, and that was simply unacceptable. The idea of individual happiness was a distant second, really. Now, it's easy to paint arranged marriages as bleak and joyless, but that wasn't always the case. While romantic love may not have been the starting point, affection and companionship often developed over time. Think of it as planting a seed. It may not be a blooming rose right away, but with careful tending, it could blossom into something beautiful. Many couples in arranged marriages found contentment, mutual respect, and even deep love as they built a life together. There was a certain security in knowing that your partner was chosen based on sound reasoning and shared values, rather than fleeting passions. However, it's also undeniable that arranged marriages could be fraught with unhappiness, especially if the couple was ill-suited, or if one partner harbored resentment towards the other. Affairs, as we've discussed, were common, providing an outlet for unmet emotional and physical needs. But even in such cases, divorce was rare, especially among the aristocracy, due to the social stigma and the legal complexities involved. Marriage was a sacred bond, after all, even if it wasn't always a happy one. And divorce? Well, divorce was a messy business that could unravel entire family fortunes and reputations. Much better to suffer in silence, or find solace in the arms of someone else. But while mariage de convenance reigned supreme, whispers of an alternative began to circulate, fueled by the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas. This was the marriage d'inclination, the marriage of inclination, or the love match. The notion that individuals should have the right to choose their own partners based on love and personal attraction began to gain traction, particularly among the younger generation. This wasn't to say that love matches were entirely new. They certainly existed before, especially among commoners who had less to lose in terms of wealth and status. But for the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, love matches represented a radical departure from tradition. It was a declaration that individual happiness was just as important, perhaps even more important, than family considerations. Of course, love matches weren't without their challenges. Marrying for love alone could be seen as reckless and irresponsible, particularly if it meant disregarding parental objections or marrying someone of lower social standing. Families often feared that love matches would lead to financial ruin, social disgrace, or both. What if this love turned out to be nothing more than infatuation? What if the object of your affection turned out to be a spendthrift, a gambler, or worse? The risks were considerable. And yet the allure of a love match was undeniable. The idea of marrying someone you were truly attracted to, someone who shared your passions and values, someone who made your heart sing, it was a powerful and intoxicating prospect. Novels and plays celebrated romantic love, fueling the fantasies of young men and women who longed to escape the constraints of tradition. Characters like Romeo and Juliet, though tragic, became symbols of the power and beauty of love, even in the face of adversity. Salons, those intellectual gatherings we talked about earlier, played a crucial role in promoting the idea of love matches. They provided a space for discussing new ideas, challenging old conventions, and exploring the complexities of human relationships. Women in particular used salons to advocate for greater autonomy in matters of love and marriage. They argued that women were just as capable as men of making their own choices, and that they deserved the right to marry for love, not just for social or economic gain. So the 18th century in France was a time of tension between these two opposing forces, the traditional arranged marriage and the emerging love match. It was a struggle between duty and desire, between family expectations and individual aspirations. While arranged marriages continued to be the norm, particularly among the upper classes, the seeds of change had been sown. The idea of marrying for love was gaining ground, slowly but surely, paving the way for a future where personal happiness would be valued alongside social and economic considerations. And that, my friends, is the delicate dance between tradition and individual choice in the realm of 18th century French dating. As we continue our journey, we'll see how these changing attitudes towards love and marriage influenced other aspects of society, further complicating the already intricate social landscape. So snuggle in, take a deep breath, and allow these historical musings to carry you ever closer to a peaceful slumber. Alright friends, let's gently explore the shifting sands of sentimentality during this time. A time when love, marriage, and societal expectations began their intricate dance of change. You might want to fluff up your pillow just a bit more. There you go. The 18th century, you see, was more than just powdered wigs and fancy balls. It was the age of enlightenment. It was a time when reason and individualism began to challenge the old order, and these ideas, naturally, seeped into every corner of society, even the seemingly impenetrable walls of courtship and matrimony. Now, for centuries, marriage had been largely a practical affair, a way to secure property, consolidate power, and ensure lineage. Love, well, that was often a bonus, a happy accident if you will, but certainly not the primary consideration. Parental approval was paramount. Family desires mattered far more than any budding romance. Think of it like a business deal, friends, with emotions taking a backseat to cold, hard logic. But the Enlightenment, it whispered a different tune. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with his emphasis on individual freedom and the noble savage, questioned traditional authority and championed the idea of natural feelings. Rousseau believed that society corrupted individuals, and that true happiness could be found by embracing one's emotions and instincts. This concept resonated deeply with many, who felt stifled by the rigid social structures of the time. And of course, there's John Locke. You can't forget old Locke. His theories on natural rights and individual consent had a profound impact on political thought, but also on personal relationships. The idea that individuals had a right to life, liberty, and property started to seep into how people viewed their own choices in love and marriage. The notion that individuals should have a say in their own destinies, and that marriage should be based on mutual affection rather than purely economic considerations, was gaining traction. These ideas started to circulate, finding fertile ground in the salons, coffee houses, and printed pamphlets that were becoming increasingly popular. People began to talk about love and marriage in a new light. It wasn't just about family alliances anymore. It was about individual happiness, about finding a partner who truly resonated with your soul. Now, it wasn't an overnight revolution, of course. The old ways died hard, especially within the aristocracy. But a seed had been planted, a seed of romanticism, if you will. And it began to sprout, slowly but surely. One of the most visible effects was a growing emphasis on companionate marriage. The idea that marriage should be a partnership based on friendship, mutual respect, and shared interests, rather than simply a transaction. People started to look for qualities beyond wealth and social standing in a potential spouse. Qualities like kindness, intelligence, and a good sense of humor became increasingly desirable. This shift in attitudes also led to a subtle but significant change in courtship rituals. While parental involvement remained important, young people began to exert more influence over their own romantic destinies. Letter writing, for example, became an art form, a way to express emotions and affections that might have been previously suppressed. Visits to relatives and friends provided opportunities for discreet encounters and stolen moments, allowing couples to gauge their compatibility away from the prying eyes of chaperones. Novels, poems, and plays of the period also played a crucial role in shaping attitudes towards love and marriage. Authors like Samuel Richardson, with his epistolary novels like Pamela and Clarissa, explored the complexities of human relationships and challenged traditional notions of virtue and morality. These stories offered readers a glimpse into the inner lives of characters struggling with love, desire, and societal expectations, further fueling the debate about the true meaning of marriage. The rise of sensibility, a literary and cultural movement that emphasized emotions and empathy, also had a significant impact. Sentimental novels, with their tear-jerking plots and virtuous heroines, became wildly popular, promoting the idea that love was the most important thing in life. Now, you might consider it a bit much by today's standards, a bit saccharine. But for many, these stories offered an escape from the harsh realities of their own lives, and inspired them to seek out genuine emotional connections in their own relationships. Now, let's not get too carried away with romantic notions. The 18th century was still a deeply unequal society. These changing attitudes towards love and marriage primarily affected the upper and middle classes. For the poor, marriage remained largely a matter of economic necessity. But even among commoners, the seeds of change were taking root, as the ideals of individual happiness and companionate marriage began to trickle down through society. But even for the privileged, things weren't always simple. The rise of romanticism didn't magically erase the practical considerations of marriage. Family expectations, social pressures, and financial realities still played a major role in determining who married whom. Arranged marriages, though becoming less common, still existed, and many young people found themselves torn between their own desires and the wishes of their families. Infidelity and affairs, of course, continued to be a feature of marital life, particularly within the aristocracy. The complex dynamics of court society, with its emphasis on intrigue and social maneuvering, created ample opportunities for extramarital dalliances. However, even in these circles, the changing attitudes towards love and marriage began to have an impact, as some couples sought to find genuine emotional fulfillment within their marriages, rather than simply engaging in a social performance. So, what are we left with, friends? A society in transition, one where the old order was slowly giving way to new ideas about love and marriage. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a significant shift in attitudes. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and individualism, had planted the seeds of romanticism, and those seeds were beginning to sprout, slowly but surely, shaping the future of relationships in ways that would have been unimaginable just a century before. It's all rather beautiful, really, isn't it? Alright now, another deep breath. That's it, let's ease into the next bit, shall we? Good evening, friends. As we continue our exploration of 18th century France, let's step away from the gilded halls of Versailles and venture into the lives of the common folk. Because, let's be honest, not everyone was waltzing at court, right? Tonight, we'll delve into the dating and courtship practices of commoners, the peasants, artisans, and merchants who formed the backbone of French society. Now, when we talk about commoners, we're talking about a vast spectrum. A wealthy merchant in Lyon lived a very different life than a peasant farmer in rural Brittany. But broadly, we're looking at individuals who weren't born into nobility and didn't have access to the same privileges and opportunities. And their approach to love and marriage reflected that reality. For the aristocracy, marriage was often about securing wealth, consolidating power, and ensuring lineage. For commoners, while those factors weren't entirely irrelevant, practical considerations were paramount. Marriage was often viewed as an economic partnership, a way to ensure the survival and well-being of the family. Think about it. Farming was backbreaking work. Having a partner to share the load, to manage the household, to raise children who could contribute to the family economy, that was crucial. Similarly, in artisan families, wives often played an active role in the family business, whether it was assisting in the workshop or managing the shop front. Marriage was a collaboration, a shared enterprise. So, how did courtship actually work for these everyday folks? Well, elaborate balls and formal introductions were generally out of the question. Instead, opportunities for meeting potential partners arose through daily life. Village festivals, markets, church gatherings. These were all common places for young people to interact. In rural areas, traditions and customs often played a significant role. Harvest festivals, for instance, were prime opportunities for young men and women to mingle. There might be communal dances, games and other activities that fostered interaction. In some regions, specific rituals or contests were even associated with courtship. Think of it like a medieval dating show, but with hay bales and possibly some questionable cheese. Another common avenue was through work. Farmhands might develop relationships with daughters of neighboring farmers. Apprentices in workshops might become acquainted with the master's daughters or other female workers. Proximity and shared labor often sparked attraction and led to courtship. Unlike the elaborate written correspondence of the aristocracy, courtship among commoners was often more direct and less formalized. Verbal communication was key. Young men might offer assistance with chores, engage in playful banter, or simply spend time talking with the young women they were interested in. Physical affection was generally more restrained than what we might be used to today. Public displays of affection were often frowned upon, particularly in more conservative communities. But holding hands, a stolen kiss, or a lingering glance, these subtle gestures could convey affection and signal interest. Family approval was just as important, if not more so, for commoners as it was for the nobility. Parents often had a significant say in who their children married. They wanted to ensure that their children were marrying someone who was hard-working, reliable, and capable of contributing to the family's well-being. Economic factors played a huge role in parental considerations. Would the potential spouse bring land, skills, or resources to the marriage? Would they be able to support a family? These were practical questions that parents took very seriously. Dowries, while not always as substantial as those in aristocratic marriages, were still common. A bride's family might provide her with linens, furniture, or other household goods to help her establish her own home. The size and nature of the dowry could significantly influence a young woman's marriage prospects. Marriage contracts were also important, though often less elaborate than those of the aristocracy. These contracts would outline the rights and responsibilities of each spouse, as well as provisions for inheritance and property ownership. They provided a legal framework for the marriage and helped to protect the interests of both parties. Arranged marriages, while perhaps not as prevalent as some might imagine, were certainly a reality for some commoners. Parents might arrange marriages to consolidate landholdings, strengthen family ties, or secure economic advantages. However, love matches were also common, particularly in situations where young people had more freedom to choose their own partners. The concept of love in 18th century France was somewhat different than what we might think of today. Romantic love, as we understand it, was certainly present, but it wasn't always the primary basis for marriage. Companionate love, based on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to building a life together, was often considered more important. Infidelity, of course, existed among commoners, just as it did among the aristocracy. However, the consequences could be particularly severe, especially for women. Adultery could lead to social ostracism, economic hardship, or even physical violence. The influence of religion was also a significant factor in shaping courtship and marriage practices. The Catholic Church played a central role in regulating marriage and promoting traditional values. Premarital sex was generally frowned upon, and couples were expected to marry within the church. Despite the social and economic constraints they faced, commoners found ways to express their affection, build relationships, and create families. Their approach to dating and courtship was often less formal and more practical than that of the aristocracy, but it was no less meaningful. Marriage was a partnership, a shared journey, and a way to navigate the challenges and opportunities of 18th century French life. So, next time you see a romantic period piece, take a moment to remember the everyday lives, loves and relationships of the often overlooked common folk. And now, friends, let's ease into our next topic, as we explore the traditions found in the countryside. Yes, our journey into 18th century France wouldn't be complete without a stroll through the countryside. Away from the gilded cages of Versailles and the bustling salons of Paris, life and love unfolded at a different pace, guided by ancient customs and traditions. So, settle in, friends, and let's explore the charming, and sometimes challenging, world of rural customs and traditions, love and marriage in the countryside. Imagine rolling hills, dotted with quaint villages, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and freshly tilled earth. Here, social life revolved around the agricultural calendar, with festivals and celebrations marking important moments in the farming year. These events, such as harvest festivals or May Day celebrations, provided rare opportunities for young people to meet and mingle.
Unlike their aristocratic counterparts, rural folk had less structured courtship rituals. There were no formal introductions arranged by powerful families, no elaborate balls, no coded messages passed through letters. Instead, relationships often blossomed organically through shared work and community activities. Think of young men and women working side by side in the fields, sharing a stolen glance or a brief conversation during a break. These small moments could spark a connection that might lead to something more. One prominent tradition was the veille, or evening gathering. After a long day of labor, villagers would gather in someone's home for storytelling, singing and games. These veilles were not just a source of entertainment, but also a crucial space for young people to get to know each other better. Imagine sitting around a crackling fire, listening to tales of local legends, while trying to catch the eye of that special someone across the room. It was at these veilles that many rural romances began. Another important custom involved the corvée, a system of communal labor where villagers would come together to help a neighbor with a specific task, such as harvesting crops or building a barn. These corvées provided another opportunity for young people to interact and demonstrate their skills. A young man who was a strong and diligent worker would certainly catch the attention of the local girls, as would a young woman known for her kindness and hard work. Of course, rural life wasn't without its challenges, and marriage was often seen as a practical necessity as much as a romantic union. Land ownership was the backbone of rural society, and marriage was a way to ensure the continuation of the family's lineage and property. Parents played a significant role in the marriage process, often guiding their children towards suitable partners who could contribute to the family's economic well-being. While arranged marriages weren't as common as in the aristocracy, parental approval was still highly valued. A young person who went against their parents' wishes risked social ostracism and even disinheritance. So, while love might play a role, it was often tempered by practicality and family considerations. The dowry system also played a role in rural marriages, although it differed from the elaborate dowries of the aristocracy. In the countryside, a dowry might consist of land, livestock, or household goods, representing the bride's contribution to the new household. These dowries weren't just about financial security, they were also a symbol of the bride's family's status and their commitment to the marriage. Wedding ceremonies in rural France were often simple but heartfelt affairs. The local church served as the focal point, with the village priest officiating the ceremony. Afterwards, the celebrations would continue with feasting, music and dancing, often lasting for several days. These weddings were not just about the couple, they were a community affair bringing together families and friends to celebrate the union. One charming tradition involved the charivari, a mock serenade performed outside the home of a newly married couple, particularly if the marriage was considered unconventional or mismatched. Villagers would bang pots and pans, sing satirical songs, and generally make a ruckus until the couple offered them food and drink as a peace offering. While it might sound a bit disruptive, the charivari was often seen as a way to ensure that the couple started their marriage with the blessing, and perhaps a bit of teasing, from the community. Despite the emphasis on tradition and practicality, love and romance did find a way to flourish in the countryside. Stories of forbidden love, secret trysts, and elopements were common, adding a touch of drama to rural life. These stories remind us that even in a society governed by strict social norms, the human heart often follows its own path. And let's not forget the role of folk traditions and superstitions in rural courtship. Love potions, charms, and fortune-telling were all used to influence romantic outcomes. Young women might consult local healers or wise women to seek guidance on matters of the heart, hoping to learn the secrets to attracting a desired partner. While we might view these practices with a bit of skepticism today, they played a significant role in shaping rural beliefs and customs surrounding love and marriage. In conclusion, dating and marriage in the 18th century French countryside was a fascinating blend of tradition, practicality, and romance. While the social landscape might have been different from our own, the fundamental human desires for love, connection, and companionship remained the same. And as the sun sets on our exploration of rural love, perhaps we can take a moment to appreciate the simple beauty and enduring power of these ancient customs. All right, gather round, history buffs. Settle in as we softly explore another fascinating facet of 18th century French society. This time we're turning our attention to a crucial element in the dating scene of the era, the often overlooked yet deeply influential role of matchmakers and intermediaries. So dim those lights, relax those shoulders, and let's gently delve into the world of relationship facilitators of yesteryear. In a society as structured and status-conscious as 18th century France, finding a suitable partner wasn't always a matter of chance encounters or passionate courtship. Often it involved a more deliberate, and dare I say strategic approach. This is where matchmakers and intermediaries stepped in, acting as facilitators in the complex dance of finding a spouse. Think of them as the original dating apps, except instead of swiping left or right, they were discreetly whispering in ears and carefully orchestrating introductions. Now the term matchmaker might conjure up images of a wily old woman with a twinkle in her eye, armed with gossip and a knack for pairing people together. And while that image isn't entirely inaccurate, the reality was far more nuanced. Matchmakers came in various forms, from professional marriage brokers to well-connected friends and family members who took on the role informally. At the more professional end of the spectrum, you had individuals who made a living by connecting eligible bachelors and bachelorettes. These matchmakers, sometimes called agents matrimoniaux, were often shrewd business people with extensive social networks. They kept meticulous records of potential candidates, noting their family background, wealth, social standing, and of course any desirable qualities they might possess. They'd then use this information to identify potentially compatible matches, acting as go-betweens to arrange meetings and facilitate negotiations. These professional matchmakers weren't cheap, of course. Their services came at a price, usually a percentage of the dowry, or a fixed fee paid upon the successful completion of the marriage contract. But for those who lacked the connections or the social savvy to navigate the marriage market on their own, they were a worthwhile investment. However, not all matchmakers were paid professionals. In many cases, the role was taken on by friends, relatives, or even trusted servants who had a vested interest in seeing their loved ones or employers happily married. These informal matchmakers operated out of a sense of loyalty, affection, or simply a desire to meddle in the affairs of others. A well-meaning aunt, for example, might take it upon herself to introduce her niece to a promising young nobleman she'd met at court. Or a family friend might discreetly suggest a potential match to the parents of an eligible daughter, highlighting the young man's impeccable lineage and substantial fortune. Even servants, particularly those who had been with a family for many years, could play a role, whispering suggestions in their master's ears, or subtly influencing their choices. Regardless of their professional status, matchmakers played a crucial role in 18th century French society. They provided a vital service by connecting individuals who might otherwise never have crossed paths, helping to facilitate marriages that were often essential for maintaining social standing, consolidating wealth, or forging political alliances. Now you might be wondering, what exactly did a matchmaker do? Well, their responsibilities were multifaceted, encompassing everything from initial introductions to delicate negotiations. First and foremost, they acted as scouts, identifying potential candidates and gathering information about their suitability. This involved discreetly inquiring about family background, financial status, reputation, and any other factors that might be relevant to a potential match. Once they'd identified a promising candidate, the matchmaker would then approach the relevant parties, usually the parents or guardians of the individuals involved, to gauge their interest. This was a delicate process, requiring tact, diplomacy, and a keen understanding of social protocol. The matchmaker had to carefully present the potential match in the most favorable light, highlighting their virtues while downplaying any potential drawbacks. If both parties expressed interest, the matchmaker would then arrange a meeting, or a series of meetings between the prospective couple. These meetings were often carefully orchestrated, taking place in controlled environments such as social gatherings, private gardens, or even carefully chaperoned carriage rides. The matchmaker would then observe the interaction, noting any signs of compatibility or incompatibility. But the matchmaker's role didn't end with the initial meeting. They also acted as intermediaries in the often complex negotiations that followed. This involved discussing dowries, marriage contracts, and any other financial or legal arrangements that needed to be agreed upon before the marriage could proceed. The matchmaker had to be a skilled negotiator, able to navigate delicate financial matters, while ensuring that both parties felt they were getting a fair deal. Of course, the use of matchmakers wasn't without its drawbacks. For one, it often removed the element of romantic love from the equation. Marriages arranged through matchmakers were often based on practical considerations such as wealth, status, and family alliances, rather than genuine affection or personal compatibility. This could lead to unhappy marriages and strained relationships. Moreover, the reliance on matchmakers could reinforce existing social hierarchies, limiting opportunities for individuals to marry outside of their social class. Matchmakers were often more concerned with maintaining social boundaries than with fostering genuine connections between people from different backgrounds. Despite these drawbacks, matchmakers played a vital role in 18th century French society, helping to navigate the complex and often treacherous waters of the marriage market. They were the original dating experts, using their social connections and negotiating skills to facilitate marriages that were often crucial for maintaining social stability and economic prosperity. So the next time you swipe right on a dating app, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those unsung heroes of the past, the matchmakers and intermediaries of 18th century France. And with that, dear friends, let us softly continue our journey into the complexities of love and relationships in a bygone era. Alright, settle in, friends. Tonight we're diving into a truly fascinating topic, but I promise to keep my tone nice and relaxing. We're going to talk about social class and how it shaped your romantic possibilities. If you happen to be alive in 18th century France, think of it as a gentle reminder that your dating pool might have been more like a very small, very specific puddle back then. Now, imagine yourself transported back to France in the 1700s. Maybe you picture yourself waltzing in a grand ballroom at Versailles, or perhaps strolling through a quaint village, but no matter where you are, your social class is practically written on your forehead, or rather, embroidered on your silk waistcoat, or stitched into your simple linen dress. It dictated almost every aspect of your life, and that certainly included who you could and couldn't even think about pursuing romantically. The most obvious barrier, of course, was the massive gulf between the aristocracy and everyone else. The nobility, with their inherited titles and vast estates, occupied the very top rung of the social ladder.
They were the elite, the power brokers, the trendsetters. Marriage for them wasn't about love in the way we might think of it today. It was about consolidating wealth, securing alliances, and producing heirs to carry on the family name and legacy. Love, well, that was often considered a happy bonus, not a prerequisite. Think of it as a high-stakes game of chess. Each family was a major player, carefully maneuvering their sons and daughters into strategic marriages that would benefit the entire lineage. A union with a family that owned vast tracts of land. Excellent. A connection to a family with influence at court. Even better. A love-struck young nobleman eloping with a penniless commoner. Utterly scandalous and potentially disastrous for everyone involved. These unions were arranged marriages in the truest sense of the word. Parents, grandparents, and other influential relatives would carefully vet potential partners based on their lineage, fortune, and social standing. Personal feelings played a very small role in the decision-making process. Marriage contracts were meticulously negotiated, outlining everything from dowries and inheritance to the rights and responsibilities of each spouse. It was a business transaction as much as a personal union. Now, let's consider the other side of the coin, the commoners. This vast group encompassed everyone from wealthy merchants and skilled artisans to peasants working the land. For them, the rules of the game were very different. Social mobility was limited, and crossing class lines in romance was exceedingly rare. A wealthy merchant, for example, might aspire to marry his daughter to the son of a minor nobleman to elevate his family's standing. However, even with a substantial dowry, this wasn't always possible. The aristocracy was fiercely protective of its exclusive status, and often looked down upon those who earned their wealth through trade. Artisans and shopkeepers, on the other hand, typically married within their own social circles. They sought partners who could contribute to the family business, or manage the household efficiently. Love and companionship were certainly valued, but practical considerations often took precedence. Could this person help me provide for my family? Were they skilled in a trade? These were the questions that mattered most. And then there were the peasants, the backbone of French society, but also the least privileged. Their lives were dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Marriage for them was often about survival and ensuring the continuation of the family farm. They typically married other peasants from nearby villages, forming tight-knit communities based on shared labor and mutual support. The idea of a peasant girl marrying a nobleman was something you'd only find in fairy tales, and those tales usually had a heavy dose of magic and divine intervention, emphasizing just how unrealistic that situation actually was. But, now, even within these classes, there were further divisions and boundaries to navigate. Among the aristocracy, there were distinctions between the old nobility noblesse de paix, whose titles dated back centuries, and the more recent nobility noblesse de robe, who had acquired their titles through government service. Marrying up within the nobility was always a desirable goal. Among the commoners, there were distinctions between the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the working class. The bourgeoisie often aspired to emulate the lifestyle of the aristocracy, while the working class focused on simply making ends meet. These different aspirations influenced their romantic choices, even if the options available to them were already limited. Of course, human nature being what it is, people sometimes defied these social conventions. Love, or at least infatuation, can be a powerful force, and there were always stories of forbidden romances that crossed class lines. A nobleman might fall in love with a beautiful actress, or a commoner might catch the eye of a member of the royal court. However, these relationships were fraught with challenges. Social disapproval, family opposition, and legal obstacles all stood in the way. The consequences for defying social norms could be severe, ranging from social ostracism to financial ruin to even banishment. So, you can see why most people, even if they were tempted to stray outside their social class, might decide it simply wasn't worth the trouble. And what about illegitimate children? Well, that's a whole other layer of complexity. If a nobleman had an affair with a commoner and fathered a child, that child would typically be considered illegitimate and would not inherit any titles or property. The mother might receive some financial support, but her social standing would be compromised. Illegitimacy carried a significant social stigma, and illegitimate children often faced discrimination and limited opportunities throughout their lives. Now, all that said, did love ever conquer all? Well, sometimes, against all odds it did. There were instances where families eventually relented and accepted a marriage that crossed class lines, especially if there were compelling reasons, such as the couple being deeply in love, the commoner possessing exceptional talent or beauty, or the nobleman being particularly rebellious. But these were exceptions to the rule, rare and often surrounded by scandal and controversy. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the complexities of love and social class in 18th century France. Remember that your romantic possibilities were largely determined by the circumstances of your birth, and that defying those circumstances could come at a steep price. It's a reminder of just how different the world was back then, and how much we take for granted today. Marriage back then wasn't just a romantic union, it was a binding legal contract. Think of it more like a business merger than a meet cute at a coffee shop. These contracts were meticulously crafted, detailing everything from dowries to property rights, securing the financial future of both families. Forget spontaneous elopements. These unions were carefully planned, often years in advance. The laws governing marriage were primarily dictated by the Church and the Crown. The Catholic Church held immense influence, considering marriage a sacrament, a sacred bond meant to be unbreakable. Divorce, as you might imagine, was virtually non-existent, especially for Catholics. Annulments, rare, and usually only granted in cases of non-consummation, consanguinity, that means related family, or other pretty serious situations, things you probably didn't even know existed. The king also had a say, because of course he did. Royal decrees and edicts shaped marriage laws, particularly concerning inheritance, property, and the social order. The monarchy saw marriage as a tool to maintain stability, prevent social upheaval, and consolidate power. So, your love life was essentially a matter of state. No pressure. Now, let's talk about women. What were their rights? Well, brace yourself. It's not exactly a feminist paradise. Under French law, married women had limited legal rights. They were largely considered subordinate to their husbands. This was codified in the Code de la Famille, which emphasized paternal authority and the wife's duty of obedience. It wasn't exactly an equal partnership. A married woman couldn't, for instance, enter into contracts without her husband's consent. She couldn't control her own earnings or manage her own property unless explicitly stated in the marriage contract. Think of it as being permanently co-signed into, well, everything. The dowry system played a significant role in a woman's security. The dowry, the property or money a woman brought into the marriage, was intended to provide for her sustenance. However, it was usually controlled by her husband during the marriage. If her husband died before she did, she usually got it back, or if the husband's behavior was deemed unacceptable, she could petition the courts to reclaim it. Still, the situation wasn't ideal. She could depend on it, but only in very select scenarios. Legally, women didn't have much recourse if they were unhappy in their marriage. Separation from bed and board, separation de corps, was sometimes granted in cases of abuse or abandonment, but it didn't dissolve the marriage. Think of it as a legal timeout, not a permanent split. You're still married in the eyes of the church and state, but at least you're not under the same roof. For women of the nobility, there was another avenue, albeit a risky one, appealing directly to the king. Noble women, particularly those with connections at court, could petition the monarch for intervention in marital disputes. These requests were often based on claims of abuse, infidelity, or mismanagement of family assets. The king, acting as the ultimate arbiter, could issue orders, mandates, or even impose sanctions. But these petitions were, shall we say, a crapshoot. The chances of success depended heavily on social standing, political alliances, and the king's whims, not exactly the most reliable form of justice. In terms of inheritance, women faced further disadvantages. While they could inherit property, they were often subject to limitations and restrictions. For instance, daughters might receive a smaller share of the inheritance compared to sons, reflecting the patriarchal norms of the time. Now, let's consider the concept of marital authority, or puissance maritale. This legal principle granted husbands extensive control over their wives. The husband was considered the head of the household, responsible for its governance, and representing the family in legal matters. As such, he had the right to make decisions regarding his wife's education, her social life, and even her health care. If a wife were to, say, run off with another man, the husband could sue for adultery. Adultery was a serious offense, particularly for women. A woman found guilty of adultery could face severe consequences, including imprisonment or banishment from society. Men, on the other hand, generally faced lighter penalties, if any at all. The disparity in legal treatment reflected the prevailing double standard, where male infidelity was often tolerated, while female infidelity was condemned. It's a classic case of rules for thee, but not for me, isn't it? Interestingly, there were regional variations in marriage laws across France. Different provinces and regions had their own customs and traditions that influenced marital practices. These variations could affect everything from dowry arrangements to inheritance rules. So, depending on where you were in France, your marital rights and obligations could differ. The Enlightenment ideas, gaining traction in the 18th century, began to challenge some of these traditional norms. Thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau questioned the subjugation of women and advocated for greater equality. These ideas slowly seeped into the cultural consciousness, influencing attitudes towards marriage and women's rights. While the legal framework remained largely unchanged, the seeds of change had been sown. Salons, intellectual gatherings, hosted by influential women, became important venues for discussing these new ideas. Women used their influence to challenge traditional norms and advocate for reforms. So, despite the legal constraints, women found ways to exert influence and shape public opinion. Outside the aristocracy, among the commoners, marriage customs were often more flexible. While legal constraints still applied, social pressure and community norms played a greater role. Love matches, while not always the norm, were more common than among the nobility, where strategic alliances often trumped personal feelings. Women in the working class had to navigate a different set of challenges. Their lives were often defined by economic necessity. Marriage could offer stability, but it could also exacerbate economic hardship. Many working-class women had to work outside the home to support their families, blurring the lines between the public and private spheres. Now, consider the consequences of breaking an engagement. A broken engagement could have serious social and economic ramifications. A woman whose engagement was broken might find her reputation damaged, making it difficult for her to find another suitable match. There could also be financial repercussions, particularly if gifts or promises had been exchanged. So, the legal framework surrounding marriage in 18th century France was complex, deeply intertwined with social norms and religious beliefs. Women's rights were limited, and their lives were largely determined by the patriarchal structures of the time. Yet, amidst these constraints, women found ways to assert agency, challenge norms, and sow the seeds of change for future generations. It's a world of contrasts, isn't it? A world where love and law were intertwined, where social standing dictated destiny, and where the whispers of change could be heard amidst the rigid structures of society. Alright, let's keep journeying on into how people actually courted. And now, friends, let's gently turn our attention to the often overlooked, yet profoundly impactful, consequences of a broken engagement in 18th century France. Imagine, if you will, the delicate balance of societal expectations, family honor, and financial security, all hanging precariously on the promise of a future marriage. When that promise shattered, the ramifications could ripple through individuals, families, and even entire social circles. For the woman, particularly those from the aristocratic or wealthy merchant classes, a broken engagement could be nothing short of a social catastrophe. Her reputation, carefully cultivated and fiercely protected, would be irrevocably tarnished. She would be whispered about, gossiped over, and quite possibly ostracized from polite society. The assumption, often unfair, would be that she was somehow at fault. Perhaps she was deemed unmarriageable because of a perceived flaw in her character, her appearance, or her family's standing. This social stigma would drastically reduce her chances of finding another suitable match, effectively condemning her to a life of spinsterhood. And remember, friends, in this era, a woman's primary purpose was to marry and produce heirs. To be unmarried was to be without a defined role, without security, and without social standing. The economic consequences were equally dire. A woman's dowry, intended to secure her future and provide for her family, would be returned to her family upon the dissolution of the engagement. While this might seem like a financial boon, it often came at a great cost. The family's reputation would also suffer, making it more difficult to negotiate advantageous marriages for other daughters. Furthermore, a returned dowry could be seen as a sign of the woman's unworthiness, further diminishing her marriage prospects. The shadow of the broken engagement could linger for years, impacting her family's social and economic well-being. For the man, the consequences were somewhat different, though certainly not insignificant. While he might escape the same level of social stigma as his former fiancée, his reputation would still be affected. He might be perceived as fickle, untrustworthy, or even cruel, especially if he was the one who initiated the breach. This could damage his standing in society, and make it more difficult for him to forge alliances and conduct business. The economic ramifications for the man were also considerable, albeit in a different way. He might face legal challenges, particularly if there was a formal marriage contract in place. These contracts often included clauses outlining penalties for breaking the engagement, requiring the offending party to pay compensation to the injured party. This compensation could be substantial, especially in high-stakes aristocratic matches, where vast fortunes were at stake.
Beyond the immediate financial penalties, a broken engagement could also disrupt the man's long-term financial plans. Marriages in 18th century France were often strategic alliances designed to consolidate wealth, secure titles, and advance family interests. A broken engagement could unravel these carefully laid plans, forcing the man to seek alternative and perhaps less advantageous matches. Now let's consider the impact on the families involved. In 18th century France, marriage was not simply a union between two individuals, but a joining of two families. A broken engagement could create deep rifts and lasting animosities between these families, potentially leading to feuds and conflicts that could span generations. Social gatherings would become awkward, business dealings strained, and alliances fractured. The repercussions could extend far beyond the immediate parties involved, impacting entire communities and social networks. The role of honor cannot be overstated in this period. A broken engagement was seen as a stain on a family's honor, a public declaration of their inability to uphold their commitments. This could lead to social shunning, business setbacks, and even physical altercations. Duels, though officially outlawed, were still a common way for men to defend their family's honor and restore their reputation. A man whose daughter had been jilted might challenge the offending party to a duel, seeking to avenge the insult and reclaim his family's standing. The legal system also played a role in the aftermath of a broken engagement. While not all broken engagements resulted in legal battles, those involving formal marriage contracts often ended up in court. Lawyers would pore over the fine print of these contracts, arguing over the terms of the agreement and the extent of the damages. These legal proceedings could be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining, further exacerbating the tensions between the families involved. Interestingly, the societal reaction to a broken engagement could vary depending on the specific circumstances. If the engagement was broken due to unforeseen circumstances, such as the death of one of the parties or the discovery of a serious illness, the social stigma might be lessened. However, if the engagement was broken due to personal reasons, such as infidelity or incompatibility, the condemnation could be much more severe. The public's perception of the situation, often shaped by rumors and gossip, could significantly impact the consequences for all parties involved. Ultimately, friends, the consequences of a broken engagement in 18th century France served as a powerful deterrent, discouraging individuals from entering into marriage lightly. The social, economic, and legal ramifications were so significant that most people would go to great lengths to avoid such a disastrous outcome. Marriage in this era was not simply a matter of personal choice, but a social obligation with far-reaching consequences. The broken engagement, therefore, stands as a stark reminder of the complex interplay of love, honor, and obligation in the world of 18th century France, a world perhaps not so different from our own in its intricate social dance. Now, let's move on, shall we? And now, friends, let's gently turn our attention to the evolving role of women in 18th century France. In doing so, we will explore how their power, independence, and romantic agency shaped the very fabric of this fascinating era. Settle in, relax, and let's begin. The 18th century in France was a period of significant social and intellectual ferment, and the role of women underwent a subtle but undeniable transformation. While still constrained by societal expectations and legal limitations, women, particularly within the aristocracy and the burgeoning middle class, began to carve out spaces for themselves, exercising influence and demonstrating a degree of agency that had previously been largely unavailable. One of the primary avenues through which women exerted power was, perhaps unsurprisingly, through marriage. Now, while arranged marriages were still incredibly common, particularly among the upper echelons of society, the motivations behind these unions weren't always solely about property and lineage. Clever women learned to wield their social connections, their wit and their charm to negotiate advantageous matches, and once married, to influence their husbands. A well-placed word in the ear of a powerful man could shape political decisions, secure patronage, or advance the careers of family members and allies. It's important to note that a woman's influence was often indirect, operating behind the scenes. Overt displays of power by women were generally frowned upon, perceived as unfeminine, or even threatening to the established social order. Instead, women learned to navigate the complex social landscape, utilizing their intelligence and social skills to achieve their goals while maintaining a veneer of feminine decorum. Think of it as a gentle but persistent current shaping the course of a river. Beyond marriage, the rise of salons offered women unprecedented opportunities for intellectual and social engagement. Salons were gatherings held in the homes of prominent women, where intellectuals, artists, and members of the aristocracy could come together to discuss literature, philosophy, and current events. These salons became vital centers of intellectual life, and the women who hosted them, known as salonières, wielded considerable influence. Salonières were not merely passive hostesses. They were active participants in the discussions, guiding the conversation, shaping opinions, and fostering connections between influential individuals. They were often highly educated and well-read, capable of engaging in sophisticated debates on a wide range of topics. Figures like Madame Geoffrin and Madame de Staël became renowned for their intellectual prowess and their ability to bring together the leading thinkers of their day. The salons provided a space for women to exercise their intellect, to express their opinions, and to contribute to the intellectual and cultural life of the nation. They challenged the prevailing notion that women were intellectually inferior to men, and they paved the way for greater female participation in public discourse. Imagine the gentle murmur of conversation, the clinking of teacups, and the stimulating exchange of ideas, all orchestrated by a woman with a keen mind and a sharp wit. Furthermore, the 18th century witnessed a growing emphasis on female education, albeit primarily within the upper classes. While formal education for women remained limited, many aristocratic and bourgeois families recognized the value of providing their daughters with a solid education in literature, history, music, and the arts. A well-educated woman was considered a more desirable companion and a more effective hostess, capable of contributing to intellectual conversations and enhancing her husband's social standing. This increased emphasis on female education had a profound impact on women's self-perception and their ability to exercise agency. It empowered them to think critically, to form their own opinions, and to challenge the traditional roles that society had prescribed for them. It also provided them with the tools to express themselves through writing, whether it was through letters, novels, or philosophical treatises. Now let's consider romantic agency. Within the confines of arranged marriages and societal expectations, women still sought love and companionship. The rise of the novel as a popular literary form provided women with new models for romantic relationships and new ways of thinking about love and desire. Novels often explored the complexities of love, the challenges of marriage, and the importance of individual happiness. Through reading these novels, women were exposed to new ideas about romantic agency and the possibility of finding love and fulfillment within or outside the confines of marriage. While societal constraints remained strong, women began to assert their right to choose their own partners, to express their own desires, and to seek happiness in their romantic lives. This, of course, was a delicate dance, as open defiance of societal norms could lead to social ostracism or even ruin. However, women found ways to navigate these constraints, utilizing subtle forms of resistance and asserting their agency in subtle but meaningful ways. They might engage in secret liaisons, correspond with forbidden lovers, or simply refuse to marry a man they found repulsive. These acts of defiance, while often hidden from public view, represented a significant challenge to the patriarchal structures that governed their lives. Now, it's important to temper this picture with a dose of reality. While some women were able to exercise power, independence, and romantic agency, the vast majority remained subject to the limitations imposed by their social class and gender. Women from the lower classes had far fewer opportunities for education, social engagement, and romantic autonomy. Their lives were often defined by hard work, poverty, and the constant struggle for survival. Even within the aristocracy, women faced significant challenges. They were often subject to the whims of their husbands, denied control over their own property, and expected to conform to strict standards of feminine behavior. The threat of scandal and social ruin loomed large, and women who stepped out of line risked losing their reputations and their social standing. Despite these limitations, the 18th century represents a crucial period in the history of women's empowerment. The rise of salons, the increasing emphasis on female education, and the growing exploration of romantic agency in literature all contributed to a gradual shift in attitudes towards women and their role in society. While full equality remained a distant dream, women began to carve out spaces for themselves, to exercise their influence, and to assert their right to a more fulfilling and autonomous life. The legacy of these 18th century French women continues to resonate today. They serve as a reminder of the power of intellect, the importance of social engagement, and the enduring human desire for love and autonomy. And as we drift further into this historical slumber party, remember the quiet strength of these women who, despite the obstacles, helped shape their world. Now, let us continue. And now, as our journey through the intricacies of 18th century French dating draws to a close, let's reflect on the enduring legacy of this fascinating period. It may seem worlds away from our modern dating apps and swiping culture, but the echoes of those powdered wigs and elaborate courtship rituals still resonate in subtle ways even today. You see, the 18th century in France was a crucible where love, status, and social maneuvering were inextricably intertwined. It was a time when appearances mattered immensely, when reputations were fragile, and when the game of love was played with carefully calculated moves. While we may no longer adhere to the same rigid social hierarchies, the fundamental human desires for connection, acceptance, and love remain constant. One of the most significant legacies of this era is the emphasis on social graces and the art of conversation. In a world without instant messaging or social media, people cultivated their communication skills. The ability to engage in witty banter, to write eloquent letters, and to navigate complex social situations was highly valued. These skills, while perhaps not as overtly emphasized today, are still crucial for building meaningful relationships. Think about it. A clever turn of phrase, a thoughtful gesture, or a well-placed compliment can still work wonders, can't they? The 18th century salon culture, as we discussed earlier, played a pivotal role in shaping intellectual and social discourse. These gatherings fostered an environment where ideas could be exchanged freely and where individuals could connect on a deeper level. The emphasis on intellectual stimulation and thoughtful conversation is something that continues to be valued in modern relationships. We still seek partners who can challenge us, inspire us, and engage us in meaningful dialogue. Furthermore, the 18th century provides a fascinating glimpse into the evolving roles of women in society. While women were often constrained by social expectations and patriarchal structures, they also found ways to exert influence and agency, especially within the context of romantic relationships. The salons again were crucial. The rise of powerful female figures like Madame de Pompadour demonstrates the complex dynamics of power and influence that existed within the French court. The legacy of these women continues to inspire us to challenge traditional gender roles and to strive for greater equality in all aspects of our lives. The emphasis on family approval, while perhaps less rigid today, still holds significance for many. Parental expectations, cultural traditions, and family values continue to play a role in shaping our romantic choices. While we may assert our independence and prioritize our own desires, the opinions and values of our families often carry weight, consciously or unconsciously. Navigating these familial expectations can be a complex process, but it's one that many of us still face in our own dating lives. And what about the ever-present dance between arranged marriages and love matches? The 18th century saw a gradual shift towards valuing personal choice and romantic love, although arranged marriages remained a common practice, particularly within the aristocracy. This tension between tradition and individual desire is something that continues to resonate today. While arranged marriages are less prevalent in many cultures, the influence of family expectations and cultural norms can still shape our romantic decisions. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of 18th century pleasure is the exploration of infidelity and affairs. The complexities of marriage, desire, and societal expectations created a fertile ground for romantic intrigue and scandalous liaisons. While we may not condone infidelity, these historical examples offer valuable insights into the enduring human struggles with commitment, temptation, and the pursuit of happiness. The double standards that existed for men and women during this period serve as a reminder of the ongoing need to challenge gender inequalities and to promote greater understanding and empathy in our relationships. So what can we truly learn from the dating habits of those bewigged and bejeweled French aristocrats? Perhaps it's that beneath the surface of elaborate costumes and intricate social rituals, there is something universally human about the search for love and companionship. The 18th century in France offers a reminder that dating is not simply about finding a partner, but also about navigating social expectations, understanding power dynamics, and cultivating personal growth. While we may no longer exchange love letters written in elegant calligraphy, the art of communication remains essential. While we may not attend lavish balls at Versailles, the desire to impress and attract a potential partner persists. And while we may not be bound by the same rigid social constraints, the influence of family, culture, and tradition continues to shape our romantic choices. Ultimately, the legacy of 18th-century French dating culture is a reminder that love and relationships are complex, multifaceted, and ever-evolving. By understanding the historical context of courtship and romance, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges and opportunities that we face in our own dating lives. So the next time you're on a date, remember those powdered wigs and secret rendezvous, and consider the enduring human quest for connection that transcends time and circumstance. And maybe, just maybe, add a touch of 18th-century French flair to your own romantic pursuits. A little bit of wit, a little bit of charm, and a whole lot of heart. After all, some things never go out of style.